Welcome to Doctor on Call with your host, DocGriffon. The Doctor will be with you momentarily. Our guest this evening is illustrator, comic book artist, 2D animator, and college professor Jeff Butler. Advisory: if you come here to chew bubblegum and kick ass and you're all out of bubblegum, 4 out of 5 doctors recommend Doctor on Call for their patients who chew gum and kick ass. Doc Griffin, paging Doc Griffin, you're needing the OR stats.
And thank you very much, Nurse Fire Mistress. Now, tonight is going to be an exceptional case. We've got symptoms here, and they're all over the place. In consultation, we found that this may be a case of severe autism for a man who can illustrate, draw, do 2D animation for video games, and also is a sculptor in his own right. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to introduce you to Mr. Jeff Butler.
Hey, Doc.
And how are things this evening?
I'm sorry?
How are things this evening?
Pretty good. We're weathering some pretty nasty storms and flooding here in Madison. It's hasn't been like this as far as I can remember, but luckily we're dry here.
And definitely, I'm not sensing an accent.
No, you mean the Midwestern twang? Oh,
yeah, I'm always kind of used to the Wisconsin kind of accent.
Yeah, it's there. It'll probably pop out as we go.
Now, for those of you who aren't familiar, not only, well, I tell you what, we're just going to go over this one at a time. There is a veritable encyclopedia of the accomplishments that Jeff Butler has done. But one of the things I'm always curious starting off, what was the first thing that attracted your eye to doing what you're doing now?
Well, I always kind of go back to Spider-Man number 25. It was the comic with the original Spider Slayer. It was a later Ditko comic towards the later part of his run, and somebody brought it to my grade school and showed it to me, and I was transfixed. I had to have that comic, and luckily my buddy didn't mind. He'd read it. He gave it to me. I took it home, and I read it until it fell apart, and I copied the drawings, and I thought, wow, it was really my first exposure to I knew comics were out there, but there was something about this that just grabbed my attention, and I had to be part of it. I had to draw it. My mom took notice of this. I was a really super energetic kid, which was code word for annoying. And and I was a middle child. She had 5 to raise, and I was right in the middle. And she had her hands full, and she was ready to take any opportunity. And this came along, and she realized that comics kept me quiet and kept me interested. And I always tell people, and it's not a joke, I pretty much learned how to read from Stan Lee. And oddly enough, my vocabulary was always leaps and bounds ahead of my peers in school. And I credit Stan for that, because I was reading, I read DC's, and I liked him. I love Batman. He's a favorite character, but the Marvels just sort of got into my blood and kind of grabbed me and took me for the ride, and they've been taking me for the ride ever since. And I've been joined at the hip with Marvel for pretty much my entire career, so can't complain about that.
And I can say the exact same thing. If it were not for Stan Lee, then I wouldn't have the vocabulary that I had. It kind of to sidetrack a personal story, it was because I was a chronic stutterer. There were certain things that I stuttered on, but then by reading Stan Lee, he would always come up with a different word for the word that I always stuttered on. And so I was magically enraptured with comic books. So who did you follow as a kid? Which books?
Well, pretty much everything coming out at Marvel. Like I said, in terms of DC, I was a Batman guy, where other kids in the neighborhood were Superman followers. And so we'd have all of the requisite arguments about that. who was a better character. But the interesting thing for me was I had an older brother, Terry, who was 6 years older, and we were in a relatively small house, and so he was stuck with me. But he loved my comics, especially the Marvels. And when I was reading Spider-Man, I was reading Strange Tales with my favorite was Nick Fury, especially during Steranko's run.
Oh, yeah.
Doctor Strange. Terry was totally hooked on Doctor Strange and Spider-Man. I always thought my brother was Spider-Man, only without the superpowers. So their lives sort of seems very similar. And I think that's why he liked it so much. But yeah, I was just about Thor was huge, the Fantastic Four. I'm telling you, I was just so into what Stan and Jack and Steve and Gene and all of the guys, Don Heck, Avengers. I love the Avengers. So I was pretty much just a comic book freak when I was a kid. I kept them in a little paper bag and carried them everywhere. My little collection.
So who was the man, the artist that you, regardless of the book, would follow as far as artists go?
Originally, it was probably Jack Kirby. Kirby captured my imagination. His stylism was weird, but captivating. His dynamism, you couldn't look away from the action in his books, and all of the crazy gizmos that he'd come up with. Then from there, I started to notice. Excuse me. Let's see, Infantino at DC was doing some amazing stuff, really beautiful covers.
Infantino is severely underrated.
Oh, well, his design, he's like too hyper stylized for some people, but his design work is what grabbed me. Even then, I didn't know what I was impressed with, but that in hindsight, that's what it was. And if you got a cover by Infantino, inked by Murphy Anderson, or Joe Villa, or people like that. I mean, some of those old detective and Batman covers have stayed with me, and I've actually done my own versions of them over the years as commissions, and those are beautiful. So then, of course, when Neil Adams started, immediately I knew that this was a sea change in comic art. My friend Steve Clark, who was a neighbor of mine, a great artist in his own right, we used to compare notes, and when we saw Neil Adams' first stuff pop up on DC covers, Batman covers, we were like, wait, hold the phone. This is different. And then, of course, Steranko. Steranko took me for a ride that I'm still on. And it's amazing when I think about how relatively little work he produced. But even to this day, I just still sit in awe of it, and was always happy that I got a chance to spend a weekend with him.
Well, and then that Steranko just basically got fed up with the comic industry, went into the movie industry, and was basically doing 2D animatics for movies. I remember I actually bought the book where they took and did all of his scene breakdowns from Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Oh, yeah.
And that was better than the actual Raiders.
You have the book. Wow.
Yeah, that was amazing. They only put it out for a little bit, and somebody said, "Hey, I thought you might like this." I'm like, "Yeah, well, you're damn straight. I love this." Because and let's talk about this, because I know this is something that it wasn't prevalent or common knowledge back then, but it was pretty much a cattle drive for artists and writers. I mean, legitimately, people weren't really treating them like the superstars that they are, but they were just getting their paycheck and going to the next book.
It was a job. I mean, these guys had to raise, most of these guys were from the greatest generation. A lot of them had been in the military or in the service in World War II.
Uh-huh.
They were trying to make a living, and that was a hell of a hard way to make a living in comics, especially after all the troubles and the
Wortham, the Dr. Wortham years.
Problems that the Senate or the congressional hearings and what that did, how that decimated the industry, and how the industry covered its butt and tried to put EC out of business.
And that killed a lot of great artists too.
It did, and when you read a lot of the accounts of that period, a lot of those artists and writers got out of comics because they were viewed as pariahs. I mean, people actually thought that to be a comic artist, you must be on the lower rung of a lower species of humanity, which is kind of sad when you think about it.
Well, even the classic story from Stan Lee, he just used to say that he wrote books.
Right.
And then when they tried to pin him down, he's like, you probably never read them before.
Right. Yep. And the ones that hung on were the ones that the artists and writers that stayed in or came back to it. By and large, those are the people that provided me and so many others of my generation that wonderful childhood that we had.
Yeah, now there was a few that actually slipped through, like Murphy Anderson, like Wally Wood. When did you start breaking down the styles? Because I'm sure that it happened to where you would set down one comic book next to the other and say, okay, well, he did it this way and he did it that way. Which way do I like more?
That's funny because DC didn't traditionally credit their creative people back then. And I'm talking the early middle 60s, and Stan credited everybody. So we love that because, even this funny things, you really became very aware. Like I said, being an artist, well, a budding artist, and having a friend who had very similar interests as that I had, we would sit there and break these things down together and talk about it, which was, I think, pretty sophisticated for kids that were 10, 11 years old. Discussing art, discussing cartooning styles, and having names, or at least code names for artists we didn't know, like Murphy Anderson, like Carmine Infantino. We didn't necessarily know who they were, but we knew their style. I remember during the old Astonishing Tales days, the old books, anthology books that Marvel put out because DC was their distributor, and they only allowed them so many releases per month.
Oh yeah,
so that's why you had those anthology titles, which I loved. But Astonishing Tales, all of a sudden, there's this artist popping in there, and he's incredibly dynamic, and his work looks totally different than anybody else's artwork. And then within a few months, I'm seeing another artist. One's named Adam Austin, and the other one's name is Gene Colan. And I'm like, wait a minute. This looks like the same guy. Well, it turns out it was the same guy. And so that's the kind of level of study we were putting into it. My dad thought it was a little weird, but my mom would always say, listen, he's reading this stuff. This is a good thing. Of course, my dad, being of the age, he was a child of the Depression. He was a writer, and he came through the 50s too. He served in World War II, and he saw the same problems that everybody saw, after the whole Wortham issues. And he was wondering, is this really a good thing for Jeff to be doing, reading all of this garbage? My mama says he's reading and he loves the artwork. How bad could this be? And she was right.
Well, and you were at the perfect time too, because it was evolving from escapism to where you go to the Neil Adams and Denny O'Neil social consciousness. Can you talk a little bit about that as a fan? Because I know this kind of relates to present day, but I think it really bears attention as to how they were doing it and why they were doing it.
Well, I think especially with like Denny O'Neil and Neil Adams, you're talking about a younger generation, sort of the young Turks starting to work their way into the bullpens at the respective companies. And they had a different worldview. They were coming from, a generation that was, had to deal with the Vietnam War. They had to deal with a lot of social upheaval. things were right to take a turn in the comic industry, and that turn probably wasn't going to happen. As much as Stan wanted to push it, it didn't feel authentic when he did it. Not to say that it wasn't good, but you really had to get it from this new breed of creator. And I think O'Neill was, aside from being talented, he was the right guy at the right time. And paired with Adams, guys essentially right around the same age. And here you had all of this its social relevance and this new style of illustration combined with it. How could you lose? I mean, and what I loved about it was that it wasn't such a hard turn that it didn't look like comics anymore, because Neil Adams, even his style, as sophisticated as his style was, he was still a cartoonist. And even though O'Neill was infusing so much social content and commentary into his books, they were still superhero comics. So it was for better or for worse. I mean, it was comics in America starting to grow up a little bit, and that process was probably overdue. And now, in some respects,
go ahead, please.
We're still feeling that, dragging the anchor of the 50s behind us, where comics had become an adult medium in Europe and in Japan and in China. We just lagged behind because of the bad times.
Well, and let's talk about some variants outside of comic books. Now, I know we talked a little bit about this previously, but what type of exposure to people like Will Eisner and Milton Kenneth, did that have any effect on you as well?
Eisner, because I admit, even when I was younger, I didn't know who Will Eisner was until Warren started to put out the Spirit magazine, and then Dennis Kitchen picked up that and kept it going. Once I saw it, I was hooked. I realized that there was something special going on here. And that was getting towards the time when I was just about starting the career. I was probably late high school, early college, and I was starting to get to know more people who know more about Eisner. Kniff I never got, which is interesting because I was well aware of Steve Canyon, and my dad told me all about Terry and the Pirates. But when I saw the stuff, it didn't speak to me.
Well, to me, it honestly seemed like that it was yin and yang, that they were complete opposites. I mean, one was a full-on cartoonist, the other one was an illustrator.
Yeah, but the thing that it took me a long time to understand were two things. One was the cartooning craft, the pushing ink, the lights and darks. That took me a while. And the other thing that took me a while to grasp was the storytelling. And I don't think that it really, I mean, I can pay a lot of lip service to what I did get and all of the analysis I did prior to becoming a professional. But that was I'm talking about being a fan. Mm-hmm. When I started drawing comics is when it started to make sense to me. And I realized, hey, this is not easy. And then I started to look back with a much greater depth of interest into what these people were doing. And then Kniff made sense. Then Eisner's storytelling jumped off the page. And I started to realize, this is why these people are lionized. And again, I mentioned earlier when we were chatting about when I got to know Steve Rude, and he was had a relationship with Alex Toth, and I put Kniff and Toth together, and I'm like, oh my gosh, there's something going on here that I need to understand better. And that's when everything sped up.
And I tell you what, those listening in the chat right now, if these names are unfamiliar to you, I hope you're writing them down, because these are some brilliant artists. These are the people who helped shape the comic books and the animations that you guys watch right now. I can't think of anybody who ever handled noir better than Will Eisner. He was brilliant. He took something that should have just been a strip, a just regular comic strip, black and white, no color, and put so much life and depth into it. Now I know Tearing the Pirates, once they gave color to them, I think it got better. Steve Canyon got better, but the foundation that artists lay upon has been created by so many great comic book artists that really never get their actual due. And, you know, these were the dream makers back then, people. We didn't have, you know, immersive 3D video games.
Sure.
And I know we're going to get into talking about your role with your involvement with Ravensoft, but at what point were you thinking? Were you sitting there in study hall staring out going, yeah, I think, yeah, I'm going to do art?
I don't think there was ever a question. Again, that might have been a little bit concerning for my dad. Again, a child of the Depression. That's sort of like telling your parents you want to be an actor.
True.
But at the same time, my mother, who was, when it came to, I have to qualify this because my dad was a sports writer. He was a newspaper man and kind of a local celebrity in our town here, and around the state. But anyway, he didn't really get my art, even though his brother was a really accomplished artist. He didn't really get the whole comic thing. He was very proud of it, but it wasn't his thing. But I was a jock too, and I played football and basketball and baseball, all of that stuff. And
weren't you the quarterback?
Yes, but I loved history. My dad and I related to each other in ways, and we're very close. But mostly that didn't have anything to do with the stuff that we're going to talk about tonight. My mom, on the other hand, was a very creative, kind of an artsy person and very encouraging. And she was always somebody that said, listen, basically, I always love this. I tell this to my students all the time. My mom was the typical mom, but with the caveat. She always said, you know, Jeff, you could do anything you want to do. And then came the but. And she'd say, but you got to be good. And I'm like, well, all right, no pressure. But you see, that made sense to me after a while because she said, listen, you've got some skill here. What are you going to do with it? And so I always took that as a boot to the backside. And I figured, well, if I'm going to do anything, if I'm going to do this, if I'm going to do this art thing, I have to be good at it. And as I mentioned before, living in flyover country, if you wanted to be a comic book artist, you had to pretty much back then, you had to learn everything on your own. There weren't any books about it.
Well, except for How to Draw the Marvel Way.
And that wasn't even out when I was starting. When that came out, it was just like, wow, this is awesome. You know, now I can put some of the stuff together that I kind of figured out intuitively. But I can remember asking my uncle, how do these cartoonists make those wonderful flowing lines? He says, they use a watercolor brush. And I was like, get out. He said, no, it's a watercolor. Winsor Newton Series 7, number 3. Buy one. Well, of course, back then they were about $12. And I thought, you know, that was more money than, I mean, that was a lot of lawns I had to mow to get it.
I was going to say, yeah, you got to cut a lot of grass to get $12 back then.
No kidding. And I remember the best thing I ever did where that's concerned was the summer before my senior year in high school. I was working on the playgrounds with all the kids all day long, and I'd come home at night, and I was getting in shape for football and all this stuff, and I'd doing a lot of running outdoors. I'd come home, and I'd sit down at the dining room table, and I bought that brush, and I'd sit there, and I would ink with that brush, and it wouldn't do what I wanted it to do. And I always tell people I made up so many different swear words to help me through the process. But eventually, I just kept at it, and it started to bend to my will. And when it did, I was like, wow, this is the most amazing tool ever. And it started a lifelong love affair with inking with a brush.
So you're setting up for your graduation. Now, I do have to say, you're still with the head cheerleader, right?
Oh, no. Yeah, you've been reading Wikipedia. Yeah, I don't believe everything I read on there. And I don't know how that gets changed either. They certainly don't let you change your own your own information. No, she's my ex-wife. We've been divorced since year 2000, and I'm remarried. And my wife Jennifer and I put our broods together and had 5 kids together, and they're all grown and out of the house now, which is kind of awesome in its own way.
Well, and you certainly look happy. It looks like you're in a conducive environment that's going to help you stay creative. And I do have to mention the fact that having parents, even if they don't understand and they're supportive of what you do, honestly, I think that is one of the greatest gifts you can ever receive.
I'm one of those people that considered his childhood to be a little bit like the Cleaver family. It wasn't, but I had a great upbringing. I had great parents. I had great siblings, and I don't look back and with the angst that some people feel towards their upbringing. I just don't have that, which I'm very grateful for.
Oh yeah, and especially in big families. I know in mine, the positions were taken as far as, who's going to be the jock, who's going to be the cheerleader, who's going to be the social person, and I ended up to be the weird creative kid. But they always, but my mother always made sure that whatever you were doing, okay, that's kind of strange, but let's see where it goes. And I'm always incredibly grateful to that to that type of upbringing, and which leads us up to you're graduating high school, so you decide, yeah, I'm going to go to college. I'm going to get just an art degree, or what were you looking for from college? Well,
I remember as a graduation present from high school, my parents got me the best present ever. They took me out to this local architectural supply store and bought me a Mayline drafting table. Up until that point, I'd been drawing on my little John Nagy piece of masonite, from the old John Nagy kit. That'll date. Yeah. People remember that, then you're old.
I am.
or the dining room table, or on my bed, just sitting up. But this was a game changer. And I don't know if you can see this back here, but this isn't the same drawing board, but this is the same parallel rule that came with that drawing board that I got back then. So it was pretty deluxe. It was pretty nice. And then I was a pretty good high school football player, and I got some interest to go to other schools to play football. I really wanted to stay in Madison. I grew up in Madison. I loved the university. I wanted to be a Badger. I thought I'd walk on the football team here and play. But I decided to go after a Bachelor of Science in Art degree. I didn't. My dad said you should get a teaching certificate, and his, being again the child of the Depression, he said you might want it to fall back on. And my response was always, Dad, if I have it to fall back on, I might just fall back on it. And he didn't quite understand that. He liked the notion of an insurance policy, and I liked the notion of keeping that fire burning in my belly. And now I'm teaching. Imagine that.
Well, no, that's beautiful because of the
Parents
fact
know.
that, yeah, I mean, who was it who said, if you're doing something that you love, then it never becomes a job.
Right. You never work a day in your life.
And so you go in. Now, it was Madison that you went to.
Yep.
You go into it, and let's talk a little bit about the mentorship. Did you find any there in college?
I had a really great TA my freshman year in drawing. His name was Dale Lays. He's a professor. Last time he's still down in Kentucky, it was his last semester as a grad student, and he was wonderful. And I really felt comfortable in my drawing classes with him because he was very accepting and very open, and yet he kind of gave you the sense that, like my mom used to say, like, if you're going to do this, you got to be good. You got to push yourself to get better. Don't rely on this. And this is something I do in my teaching now too. It's don't stay in that comfort zone, because we don't learn there. You got to push yourself outside of that. And he was very good at that. And this is interesting, because now that I went back to school in my twilight years here, it's totally different now. Back then, having commercial aspirations and much less wanting to be a comic artist or a cartoonist, that was pretty much looked down on back then in the art circles. And it wasn't really any different in the art department at the university. Among students, it was kind of cool, but the professors weren't that, you didn't really talk about it, because you might get a little bit of ridicule. You certainly wouldn't get much serious interest in having ambitions like that. So I kind of flew under the radar for a lot of it. I struggled a little bit, because that was also the era where self-expression was the thing. Not that it isn't all the time, but there were some classes where there wasn't really a lot of instruction going on. You would kind of buy your supplies, and then you'd sit down, and the professor would say, well, go to it. And you're like, okay, but I'm paying a lot of money here to learn how to go to it. And, not every class was like that. I had a few, my life drawing with John Wilde at the university was awesome. Again, he had gone to school with my uncle and my mentor from high school, Parnell Bach, who was so encouraging. But I didn't get the same kind of encouragement in college. And so I drifted a little bit. I have to admit I did.
And I'm curious too, what class was the thorn in your side as far as art goes? Was there some type of, be it expressionist or just doing pen and ink or 3D? Was there something that vexed you?
The classes, I was pretty good going with the flow. So it wasn't necessarily a class or a medium. It would have to have been more a couple of professors' personalities that probably got me off track a little bit. And I'm talking about a minority. I'm not talking about everybody, because most of my professors are great. Mm-hmm. But there were a couple that, I didn't get a feeling that they were very helpful or really wanted to kind of put you on a track for success. So,
and was it more just that it's not that you didn't have a grasp, it's that they weren't inspiring enough to get you down the road?
Well, not to put too fine a point on it, there was at one point I had a professor tell me that I described me as a technical virtuoso, and then made sure that I understood that wasn't a compliment. Basically, I could draw very well, but that wasn't really enough. Apparently, I didn't have the conceptual chops to go along with the drawing skills. So, but my response was always, well, that's why I'm here. That's why I'm in college, to learn. So there were some rough patches like that, but at the same time, I always have to go back and say, I was rolling with it, and I was getting some pretty good foundational, fundamental teaching or learning, and my skills were definitely improving, because up until that point, I'd never had that sort of aesthetic boost. When you're in college, you're exposed to so many things. The liberal arts education was awesome, I have to tell you. And when my eyes were open to all of this other stuff, it made my art better. And I could feel that I was getting better. I never lost my ambition, though. And I never fell into the fine art, I don't know, that sort of camp where everybody just decides they're going to get really creative and weird and counterculture. I never let go of my desire to be a cartoonist and an illustrator. And I just sort of said, listen, this is all part of the learning process. I gotta go through this, I guess. Not that it was an ordeal, but I just figured to get to where I want to go, this is one of the steps I have to take.
Well, or to kind of parallel it, like boot camp.
Exactly. And I did appreciate the fundamental or the foundational preparation I was getting. My life drawing classes, drawing the human figure, I loved that. I had a couple of design classes that forced me to think in ways that I hadn't tried before. And you know, starting to get your brain thinking and going down creative paths that's new, especially when you're, you know, 18, 19 years old. And you know, high school, you come out of high school drawing pretty well, or you thought you drew pretty well. Now you're in a pool with a lot of people that draw well, and you have to figure out, okay, what kicks this into another gear? And that was all part of the process.
So basically, big fish, big pond, learning how to swim.
Yeah, that's the way athletics were too. I mean, you come out of high school being a pretty good ball player, then you get to a Big Ten school, and everybody on that field is really good, and you just realize how, you know, the pond, pond just got more populated with big fish, just as you said.
And since we're at the bottom of the hour, I'm going to go ahead and people know that I have been swearing about this all day about getting this online, but I want to show you some of Jeff's work. Now, of course, you can always take a look at it on his website. It's located down in the description box at jeffbutler.com. Well, jeff-butler.com. And also, I do want to play up my boys. I'd like to thank some criminally undersubbed people. They're also in the box. So if you haven't tuned into those guys, please make sure and do so. I would also like to thank Jolly Rogers Bilgewater from last week. Since I don't have Streamlabs up, he hit me with Streamlabs last week, and I just want to thank him for doing that. So here we're going to go, and we're going to actually jump in. Let's see if I can do this, because I am a total goof when it comes to this. But let's see here. We want to do that.
Wow, where'd you find that one?
I did some digging, and I love the Phantom too.
Yeah, that was a commission.
I can't say that I like anything better. It's a tie for me, but we'll get into this later, between the Green Hornet and the Badger. I love the Green Hornet stuff.
Oh,
I can't get enough.
Like to hear that.
Now, I have to say, outside this, did they initially approach you for doing the Green Hornet 66?
No. The whole Green Hornet thing came towards the tail end of my days at TSR. That's a whole nother story.
Well, yeah, but you know, the thing that I'm thinking of is just the fact that you already had the experience to do it.
Oh, you mean Dynamite now?
Yeah.
Dynamite has never once contacted neither Ron Forty nor myself to do anything, which, I mean, it's fine. At one level, I understand that, because they were trying to kind of break and do their own thing with the character. But we get a lot of people who contact us through social media and through the website that are just like, why don't you do stuff for Dynamite? And I'm just like, well, because they've never asked. But that's, like I said, I do kind of understand it.
Yeah, but you know, in our standpoint, you know, looking from the bleachers, of course, is the fact that you've got a ringer. You've got somebody who can come in and do it, and they've already shown that they can do it. And I did include the Adam West Batman and Robin sketch that you did. It's certainly there, and we'll get into also talking about likenesses. You do some incredible likenesses too.
Yeah, and you know what's fun about the Green Hornet stuff is I still get a lot of commission requests.
Oh, wait a minute. Let me flip over to you. There you go. Oh, that's brilliant.
And these are always fun to do. A lot of them end up being Green Hornet covers that never were. And I love doing that. So.
And I love the age distressing that you did on that too.
Yep. Yeah,
that is awesome.
It's fun.
And
You could see that.
and yeah, I mean, there's some beautiful stuff that you do, and honestly, I don't mean to fanboy out, but I've always been attracted to quality.
Oh,
And I've never seen you lack in that.
oh, you're too kind.
And well, and it's kind of rare. And I don't know if we want to get in. Let's get into that discussion later about comics nowadays. By the way, the Godzilla is up. That is gorgeous.
That
I
was.
don't know how much time that took to make that page, but that's mind blowing.
That actually went pretty fast because I was so inspired. Plus, Mike Barron was writing that book too, so we got thrown together again.
Well, yeah, and I mean, it doesn't seem like anything is off limits to you. Is that something that you developed? When you were developing your thicker skin and learning in college, is that something that you developed there, or would you say that was naturally ingrained?
I think the desire. People talk about perfectionism. That wasn't really it. It was probably more that sort of imposter syndrome where you have to prove to yourself that you're good. That for me kind of pushed me towards maybe trying to do more than I needed to do in a lot of cases. But really what happened is when I started drawing comics, it hit me how little I knew about drawing. It struck me that I needed to get better at drawing everything because as a comic book artist, you have to draw whatever you're called on to draw, and it has to be convincing. That's one of my buzzwords for my students, my cartooning students, is it doesn't have to be realistic. Realistic and convincing are two different things. Realistic can exist in a stylistic way as a convincing visual shorthand of whatever it is you're trying to draw. And that's cartooning. And that sort of came to me as I was learning. And I can't say it was an independent thought. It came to me by studying people like Toth and Kniff and, the guys that made it look so easy back in the golden age of cartooning. And you're forced to study their craft so that you can incorporate what they did into your style and your approach. And that's, like I said, that was a learning curve in and of itself.
And that's I think this falls into, and without being preachy, I everybody that I've interviewed, they've hit the same three things, which I've kind of termed to called flexing your pecs, which you have to have passion, you have to make the effort, and you have to be committed. And that means putting your nose to the grindstone. That means loving what you do. That means taking what you've got and challenging yourself, stretching the boundaries, because if you stay within a safe space, you're never going to be the artist that you believe you can be.
That's true. That's absolutely true. You got to push yourself out of those comfortable places and challenge yourself to do things that you've never tried before. And that's the only way you grow, especially artistically.
And so what was your biggest challenge? Something to master, something to conquer when you were in high school or when you're in college, excuse me.
Well, I think when I was in college, I was pushed without them realizing it by a couple of upperclassmen who could draw extremely well. And I realized that these people were far advanced from where I was, and that I really needed to kick into a higher gear. That was, and I've always been very competitive like that. Not personally competitive, but realizing that, okay, if I'm going to cross the finish line that they're approaching, I got to get faster, or I got to get my skills up. And
sure.
Then it became the challenge from then was I want to be able to do everything well. I mean, whether it's pen and ink or brush and ink or just value drawing with a pencil or painting or sculpting, all of this stuff, I just thought to myself, if I'm going to do it, I better get good at it. Otherwise, there's no point in it at all. So that, I think that sort of that attitude kind of kept me buoyed the whole way through. It was never I never browbeat myself. It was always more of a carrot than a stick kind of a thing.
And I know I've talked to many people who have been like that. You've got your inspiration, but the fire definitely has to come from you to be able to say, you know what? No, I can do this better.
Oh,
you
yeah.
know what? I can push myself forward. You think that's good? Wait till the next one.
Well, I've run across this in my teaching. From time to time, I'll get a student that has some skill, but they just don't have the desire to really take it any farther than they've taken it, which just drives me nuts, because I think, wow, you've got some foundational stuff going on here. All it takes is a little bit of motivation and some hard work, and you're gonna ramp this skill into a different level. And I get pushback, like, yeah, I don't know, I just kind of like doing it this way. And I'm like, are you nuts? Are you crazy? I actually got into it with a student. And again, he was a young guy. He was probably pretty fresh out of high school, and he had some skill, but there were some real glaring holes in his skill set. And I was trying to get him to try to fill those and buttress them up a little bit. And he got very frustrated with me. And one day I was trying to push him, and he got mad, and he turned to me and he said, Jeff, doggone it, I've been drawn. He didn't say that, but he said, I've been drawn this way my entire life. And I said, have you been doing it wrong for that long? He gasped, and he just looked at me like, how dare you? And then all of a sudden he realized what I was saying, and I was joking with him. But the point is that that little bit of back and forth sort of triggered something, and he kind of, all of a sudden he got it. He understood what I was trying to do. And from then on, he started to, I thought his art started to grow considerably. I have had other students who all they wanted to draw were furries, and they'd get so mad at me when I'd say, this is a furry-free zone. Say that 3 times fast. But the fact is, I've got nothing against furries. I wanted them to get to improve their drawing in general. Once you can draw something in your sleep, you're stuck. If that's all you can do, you're stuck. And I wanted to take that off the table and challenge them to go down different paths with their creativity. So,
well, and that's the thing. You have to continually expand and grow, because as an artist, you can't limit yourself to say, well, okay, the only thing I'm ever going to do is pen and ink.
Right.
You have to be able to pick up the brush, whether it's oils, acrylics, watercolors. You have to be able to do those expressions in many different mediums. And I think that's going to lead us in, but I do want to make sure, guys, we're close to the top of the hour. Please do make sure and have your questions loaded up and ready. I'm going to try to scroll back, but remember, I'm an old man, so I might miss one or two. So please make sure and do have those questions set up for us. And so that leads me into you're in school. And there's this guy named Steve Rude, or excuse me, Mike Barron, that's saying, hey, I got this idea for a comic book. Did that make you stray? Or was that something where you were like, oh, yes, I've been dying to break out and do something?
Well, at the time, and I was still in college, and I was taking a lighter class load because I was actually doing a lot of illustration work locally and advertising work. And so I was kind of making a part-time living doing that. I was also working in the emergency room at a local hospital. So I had my fingers in a lot of pies. And one of the things that I had done a rush poster for a fraternity on campus. And they wanted something real cool that was the prerequisite. I don't care what it is. We just want it to be cool. So I drew a Conan figure kind of lurching forward, like he's coming at you, and he's got a mace and he's got a shield and a helmet on. And there's a big kind of a dynamic caption above his head, or a word balloon. It says, "We're out for blood, new blood." And they love this thing. And they put it up on all the kiosks and telephone poles all around, Fraternity Row and campus. And it made a pretty good splash. So I was living with a buddy of mine who had a house, and he was working, and he rented a room out to me. And I remember I get a phone call. And I had known Steve Root already. We had hung out a bit, and we had mutual friends. And I knew that they were doing Nexus and at Capital Comics. And I knew a lot of those guys because we had a lot of acquaintances in common. And I get a call, just a cold call out of the blue. And this guy, it's Barron. And he's just like, "Hi, I'm Mike Barron. I write comics, and I want to come see you." And I'm like, "Oh, okay." And I told him where I was. And about 15 minutes later, he shows up at my door, and I answer the door, and there's this guy. He looks like he's 16 years old. He's 10 years older than I am, but he's the perennial youthful kid, And he just looked at me, and he held up my poster. He had torn it off of a telephone pole. And he said, "You did this, right?" And I said, "Yep." He goes, "How'd you like to do comics?" And I went, in my head, "Well, duh." Of course I would. And he came in, and we sat down and just started talking. He was looking through my portfolio as we were talking. And he said, "Yeah, Capital's looking for something to follow up Nexus with. And I got this idea about this. I want to do something different. And what would you like to do?" I said, "Well, it'd be fun to do something fantasy oriented." He said, "Well, I've been thinking about this 5th century druid." And I said, "Oh, wow, that sounds kind of interesting." And so he took it back to John Milt at Capital City. And their response was, "That sounds really great, but we really want to do a superhero." And he was just like, "Oh, God, another superhero?"
So Ham just wasn't cutting it then.
Well, they liked Ham, but they didn't see him as, a tent pole, shall we say. And so, and Mike and I had started work on it, and I had done a few pages already. And because I was really into it, I was like, "Wow, here's my chance." So, and in the meantime, they had me letter an issue of one of the black and white issues of Nexus, and it was horrible. I was a terrible letterer back then. And so I said, "I don't want to do that." I just thought anything to just get in with these guys. So after Mike talked to John and Milt, he came back and he says, "They want to do a superhero." And he was just like, and it's a legendary story, but it's true. I mean, he said, "Why would anybody want to put on long johns and go out and fight crime? I mean, you really have to be nuts." And of course, that's all it took. And Mike's head, he never stopped creating, and the gears started to turn. And he thought, okay. And the next time he went off, he thought about it. The next time we talked, he said, "Listen, we're going to do this. I got this idea." And this guy, he's crazy. He thinks he's a superhero, and he lives here. And the neat thing about it is we're going to put Ham and we're going to put these two together. And at that point, I thought Mike had gone off the rails. I thought there's just no way that they're going to buy this, but they did. And the rest is sort of history. I guess, is small press history, I guess. So.
Well, and I know there were quite a few people who said, "Well, this was a Moon Knight thing, ripping off Moon Knight, but didn't you guys beat Moon Knight to press by like about 8 or 9 months?"
Well, it's funny. I don't know. I couldn't tell you for sure because I was not an early Moon Knight devotee at all. And a lot of people said, "Oh, this is you're just ripping off Wolverine." And I said, "No, that's not it either. You got a similar kind of an animal, but we're in a different realm here." And so the whole, at first it wasn't the multiple personality thing that it became. It was just that this guy's got some serious issues. But Mike did not want to take this and turn it into a dour kind of a downbeat story about psychosis or anything like that. He wanted to have a little fun with it, and not shy away from the story possibilities, much less the comic possibilities of this guy. And I thought it was interesting how he took Ham and created sort of a straight man, and a powerful straight man for all of this too. The guy that sort of, he was in some respects, he was the fulcrum on which the Badger turned. And that was part of Mike's creative genius. And I think I mentioned to you when we were chatting that as an artist, and I'm sure Steve, the dude, felt this way too. As artists, you would get his wonderful little Harvey Kurtzman, sketched out strips on the legal pad. And I would read through these things and I would have to shake my head. I would think, wait a minute, what is he doing here? And then I'd have to go back and read through it a couple of times, and then it'd dawn on me. And the funny thing is after you put several issues of this together and you go back and you think, oh my God, he was aiming it this way the whole time. And, it was just never evident at first because Mike, like I said, Mike was always so far out ahead of the artists creatively. And his ideas at times would seem so out there that it was hard to digest. It was hard to kind of to make sense of them in the context of the story you're trying to tell without feeling like, oh man, the reader's going to totally roll their eyes at this. But as he strung it all together, all of a sudden it's like, oh my gosh, he's creating his own little opera here, which is pretty satisfying because you're sort of along for the ride.
Well, and I will definitely give Baron credit on this. He set up his heaven and earth. Heaven was Nexus, earth was Badger.
Yep.
And he did them all in a very eloquent style. And I think he picked two artists that nailed it without a problem.
Well, when I came on board, I was fully committed to go as far as I could with Badger. For me, it turned out to be the first 4/5 issues, and then I saw that you had the unused cover for issue 6.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, that was a fun one to do. Mike owns that original, but the thing was, as I started to get comfortable, and as I started to really, what I thought I started to hit my stride, but as I was doing this, I had a very an overarching feeling that I still hadn't learned enough to really be good at this comic continuity thing. I still felt like I was learning as I was going, not realizing that really everybody does this. But I started to, when I was looking at Steve Rude's pages, and I was thinking, man, I'm not there yet. I've got so much I still have to learn. And so I was feeling that urge to really kind of up my game. And at the same time, a friend of mine who was an instructor at Madison Area Technical College had suggested that I should check out this place down in Lake Geneva because they were looking for a black and white artist. And I did a little research on it, this place called TSR Incorporated, and they were only about an hour and 15 minutes away. And I thought, well, that might be worth looking into. And then I realized that, they were the creators of Dungeons and Dragons, and they were doing some amazing stuff, and their artists were amazing. I had just blown out my knee playing City League basketball with Les Dorscheid, who was on my team, and Les was a great artist. And he was our colorist for the Badger and Nexus. And I went down there on crutches. My mom drove me down to Lake Geneva because I couldn't drive because it was my right leg. I was in a cast. And I met Jim Rosloff in the little common area off of the reception area, and he took a look at my portfolio and hired me on the spot. It was a whirlwind, and I was dizzy. Then he took me up to meet the guys in the art department, and I was slack-jawed. I had seen their work on books and modules, but I'd played a little D&D in college. But being there and seeing it all firsthand, I was just like, oh my gosh, this is going to be an incredible move for me. So that's why I left Badger. And the guys at Capital City, Rich Bruning and Mike and Corinne Price and Steve Welch and all that, they threw a nice going away party for me. We all got together and shed a few tears. And Mike Barron even drew his own version of the Badger, which I still have in my in my possession. So it was kind of a bittersweet time.
And I will say that at that point in my life, I was a comic book store manager. And anytime you did your guesting onto the Badger, I'm like, here, this is the book that you have to buy. And they're like, why? And I was like, shut up and read it. I'll give you your money back if you don't like it. Never had a single person cash in on it.
Wow.
And that's just a testament to how awesome that your art was, how attractive, how engaging that it is. And I do want to make sure this is my segue to engage some of the audience here. There's some questions that I've lined up, and I want to make sure to get the audience in, because without the audience, we are nothing. And now we do have one from Jack T. Ripper, the Golf City serial killer. He asks, CG artistry or hand-drawn? Which is more fun to do?
Oh, boy. Wow. I hate to be a wuss with a question like that, but I love them both. I've taught them. I teach them both. It just, for me, it depends on my mood. I can't stay away from pencil and paper for very long, but yet I still love sitting down at my Cintiq and just drawing. I've got a little, I can show you this. I got this little thing called a Modbook Pro that I use all the time when I'm on the go. This little weekend away, I got to use it a bit. So yeah, I love digital art, and a lot of times, and this is what some people who are not familiar with digital versus analog art might not appreciate, is a lot of the stuff that I do these days, especially with commissions, with concept art, a lot of it is hybrid. So I'm working both. I'm working back and forth from digital to regular pencil and paper. That the commission I showed you, a lot of times what'll happen is those will start out as a digital sketch, and then I will print those out as a blue line and ink them on Bristol or illustration board. Yeah. And then I'll scan them and take them back in and color them in Photoshop. So like I said, it sounds a little manic, but it makes a lot of sense. And it really helps you get the most out of both digital and traditional art.
Well, I think it's safe to say that you found a happy medium to where you can both make them work together.
Yeah, I love it. I teach digital sculpting also with ZBrush, and I spent a week in California with some of the most amazing special effects artists. We had a master's class out there, and it was taught by Andrew Korse, who at the time was, he owns Anatomy Tools. And then Carlos Huante was the lead teacher, and he was, at the time, he was the lead character or creature designer at Industrial Light and Magic. Yeah. And it was an amazing week. The people, there was 22 of us artists there to learn, and we were all pros. And everybody in that room was a pro working in either Hollywood at ILM or at Lucas or at Pixar or at Disney. And several of us were working in video games. But the whole week, all of these guys were all digital sculptors and digital creature creators. But that whole week was all traditional sculpting. And they all, to a person, they all said the same thing. This is where you learn how to do it. You really don't learn how to sculpt until you get your fingernails dirty and you work your way around a real 3D model, not a virtual 3D model. So yeah, it's like I said, I straddle that fence all the time, and I wouldn't have it any other way.
Did you feel like you were back in college?
Wow, I'll tell you something. That nothing really prepares you to be thrown into a pool of talent like that. In college, it's one thing, and I suppose there was a similar feeling, but this was at an entirely different level, and it was one of the most creatively immersive experiences I've ever had. I learned so much in that week. I can compare it to being thrown into the art department at TSR with Larry Elmore and Clyde Caldwell and Jeff Easley and Keith Parkinson.
Those are magical names.
Oh, but you know, they're my brothers, you know, and whenever we get together, it's like we've never been apart. But being thrown into that kind of pool of talent, you can't help for just by being close to that creativity, you learn so much. And I remember at the end of the week, Carlos came up to me, and I was one of the oldest guys there. So most of the artists at this master's class were relatively young. But he says, "Man, why aren't you out here?" I was like, "Yeah, that's great to hear." But you know, my family's back there, and I'm doing stuff back there. But it was really great to be accepted by such, like I said, such incredibly talented people.
Well, now here's a nice follow-up by John Doe. He asks, do you do digital art? Of course you do. And if so, what is your preferred software?
Well, it depends. If you're talking about drawing and painting, if I'm working on the computer, it's pretty much Photoshop. It's because it's not, well, it's the industry standard. And it became that way because most of us in the video game industry took to it 20, 25 years ago, and we've been using it ever since. So that became my digital drawing and painting. Now, if I'm on my iPad, I love Procreate. I'm still just learning it, but that's a really great app to draw and paint with on an iPad. But if you're talking about sculpting, digital sculpting, that would be ZBrush. And there really isn't. I mean, there's been a lot of other programs that have come out, like Mudbox was going to overtake ZBrush. I'm not sure that it ever did. I don't do a lot of ZBrush sculpting these days, but because I'm having so much teaching traditional sculpting, I've sort of gotten away from the digital stuff. But that's when I am working in digital 3D, I'm using ZBrush.
Great. Now, Fire Mistress of Human Resources asks, what do you think of artists that draw online doing live streams?
What do I think of them? Good for them. Especially if, you know, they're giving other people a chance to see something that they might not otherwise see. I teach classes at cartooning and character design classes, because when I was younger, I would have crawled over broken glass to take classes like this because there just weren't any. There were a handful of art classes that were somewhat related to cartooning. There was a great Bill Feeney, who was a great cartoonist. He was also the head of the old commercial art program at MATC, where I teach now. He was great because he could give us a lot of information as an old pro that you couldn't get anywhere else in flyover country. So I think it's great. The internet is so amazing because there's so many people out there working and willing to show people how they're doing things. It's so great. I used to have to go to the library and just scrounge books just to answer a couple of very simple questions. Now you just Google it and you're there. And if you have people that are willing to kind of share their techniques, I think that's awesome. Now, on the other hand, along with that comes a very large amount of garbage that's out there. But you have to be able to sift through that. I mean, I think that's kind of, you have to take the small negatives with the great potential and positives of having people share all of these things that so many other people might not be exposed to without this type of technology.
Yeah, that definitively makes sense. And there's a follow-up. Are there any books and or resources that you would recommend for reference?
Specifically for?
Yes.
In general? Well, you know, those kinds of questions are always tough because it's sort of like asking who's your favorite kid.
Well, and I think it also depends upon what genre that you're looking to tackle, because if you're trying to do, if you're trying to do manga, then that's definitely going to be a different set of principles than if you're trying to draw comics the Marvel way.
Well, exactly. And we talked about that when we were chatting earlier too. The How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way book came out I believe when I was in college. And that was really the first of its kind that really was sort of mass market, where it was available everywhere. And I loved it, even though at that point I knew most of the information, but I thought, this is great. This is something I would have loved when I was a kid. And I think the book holds up pretty well as a good cartooning resource even today. And I hear people denigrating it, but I think that's just because it's fashionable sometimes.
Oh, well, it came out in 1978. And I know there's a lot of people in our chat who weren't around in 1978. And it was a godsend.
Yes, it really was. I mean, there were people, we had been waiting so long for that book. And a couple of artists had put out little pamphlets and little comic-sized digests of how-tos. And I've always been a collector of that stuff. I collect all sorts of old how to draw books and how to cartoon books, and I love them.
Well, and didn't Kubert do one just before Marvel did the Sal Buscema one?
He did, but he was getting his school started up, and that's a place I was dying to go out there. In Dover, New Jersey, back in the early, I would have been with some of the earliest classes there, but I couldn't swing it financially at the time. So it was
yeah, I would have loved to have been there. That's just, I mean,
I was jealous of him. So
not being ribald, but that's a comic book fan boner right there for anyone.
Yeah, and being as big a fan of Joe as I was, it would have been great to learn, in that kind of a setting from a master like that, and someone who is so generous with their knowledge. And really, this is something else, and this is what I tell my students. The thing about cartooning, and Joe always talks about it being cartooning. Okay, this isn't necessarily illustration. This is cartooning. This is a craft, and you have to learn how to do it. The thing with him was, like I said, he was so generous with the tips and how I don't want to use the word shortcuts because that sounds like you're cheating, but in a way, there's doing it the hard way and there's doing it the economical, crafty way.
Well, work smart, not work hard.
Exactly. And when you're learning on your own, it's always so wonderful when somebody says, hey, you know what? You got to try this instead. And then your eyes get real big and the light flashes over your head. And moments like that really kind of can propel you forward quickly. And having a school like that, I would have loved to have been out there. I mean, seriously. And that's, like I said, that's why I like teaching this stuff now, because there still aren't that many places, especially in the Midwest, where this, cartooning and comic art are taught seriously. It's changed a lot, but there's still not that many places.
And I honestly forget the name, but I remember the first guy that ever advertised it. And it was like Arnold or somebody like that. I don't remember the last name, but it sounded shady as hell. But the first time that I ever saw something, I was like, yeah, I can believe in that, was because of Kubert. I mean, people already know that my gimmick comes from a cross between the Invisible Man, but mostly from Unknown Soldier.
Yep.
I was an incredible fan of Kubert, and people were just like, oh, well, this looks sloppy. This doesn't look like, and it's like, are you just not seeing it? I mean, he's telling a story to where you could white out every single word balloon and you'll still understand exactly what's going on.
And that's the craft. And that's the thing that so many people who want to be comic artists forget. Everybody wants to draw big figures standing around doing incredible things, but they forget that there's more to it than that. The story has to be told. The art is really in service of the story. And if you're not telling the story visually in a compelling manner, you're kind of screwing up the writer, because you're illuminating those words. And if you don't do it properly, the story falls apart. And Kubert was amazing, even at an early age. I was drawn to Kubert's work because he could tell any kind of story, and it was always really good. When you think about it, I think he got into the industry when he was like 15 years old. So, I mean, he'd been doing it for a long time, and he'd learned at the feet of a lot of very talented people.
And he had such grit.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, that's the word that comes, that's the adjective that comes to mind anytime I think of Joe Kubert. He had grit.
Yes.
And you could feel the visceral nature of his art.
I fell in love with his war books. I mean, I was a big Sergeant Rock. I was a big Unknown Soldier fan. And I mean, those are the, other than the Batman books, those were the things at DC that I was really drawn to. And then when he started to do Tarzan, I was knocked out because I was a huge Tarzan fan.
That was amazing stuff.
Oh, did you see that artist edition that they came out with? I did. That was a late in life revelation for me going through that. And then he did. This is one that a lot of people don't remember when he did the quote updated version of Fire Hair, which was the little redheaded Indian. That was brilliant stuff, and I couldn't get enough of it.
Yeah, I mean, there are people. I mean, I run into people every day talking about how awesome Todd McFarlane is. Yes, he's awesome. Excuse me. Yes, he is awesome. I've sat back and watched him ink his own stuff. But I've seen Kurt Swan.
Yep.
And if you can't put those two on the same shelf, you're missing out on your art education. People like Wally Wood, Russ Heath, Will Eisner, all of these people were just amazing in what they did. And all the people who came on later, if you think that they didn't build off of these magnificent artists, then you are completely deluded. They are, like I said, the strongest house has the best foundation. And these artists came along, and people don't understand that they were getting, pennies on the dollar to grind out the amount of artwork that now people like Roy Lichtenstein. I mean, he legitimately just copied what they were doing in the 50s, and it's selling for hundreds of thousands of dollars. And these guys did it for, a $50 paycheck a week.
Yeah, that's a whole nother story. That's swiping on a grand scale.
Yeah, I do not disagree. Let's see here. Okay. I think we're almost caught up, but we did leave people on a cliffhanger. And we had an ask of, does Anatomy for the Artist by Gino Barskay sound familiar?
Yes. Yeah, and I think I'm not sure if that's the correct pronunciation of the name, but there's a whole bunch of really good anatomy books out there. The ones that I usually tell my students to shy away from are the Bern Hogarth books, and it's not because I don't like Bern Hogarth. It's that his anatomy is so highly stylized and peculiar to him that it's sort of a more of an advanced approach to anatomy, especially cartooning anatomy. So I usually tell students that are just starting out in cartooning and comic art to kind of avoid those books at the beginning and get a little bit more traditional approaches to anatomy. And there are some really great books out there. One of my favorite books about cartooning is, we were talking about books before, and this is one that just sort of stands out to me. And there's quite a few, but one that always pops into my mind is what is it? Oh shoot, I can't remember that, but it's the Ben Caldwell books on cartooning. Ben Caldwell's an animation designer, and he's done a couple of books. I think the first one was called Action Cartooning, and it's available out there. It's all over the place. And then there was his follow-up was called Fantasy Cartooning. And that one's, I think, out of print and a little harder to come by, but it's an equally good book. But if you're into cartooning, those things, I highly recommend those books, because there's some really, really sound drawing instruction in those books, but it's also attached to some really awesome artwork.
Well, and literally, you do have to give a budding artist a loose template instead of saying, this is the way that I do it, you have to do it this way.
Well, and I've always been a proponent of small successes. When I'm teaching somebody, I don't have them draw from a figure right away. I mean, that's kind of daunting, because the human body is an amazingly complex thing to draw. So you want to kind of ease them towards that. You want to build the skill and the confidence level before you take on such a complicated subject. But which is why I enjoy a well-written book on cartooning, and that's why I like the Caldwell books, because there's some good constructive anatomy in there that sort of eases you towards a more sophisticated approach to drawing, for example, the figure. And really what it comes down to is learning how to break things down, especially if you want to get into cartooning, if you want to get into comic art. It gets back to being convincing. What are the foundational shapes that make up what you're trying to draw?
And you need to understand the nuance.
Exactly. Start simple. Don't. I'm working with somebody right now who's aspires to be a comic artist, and they've got some ability, and they've got some storytelling ability, which usually comes later. And their drawing isn't quite there yet, but it's coming along. And one of the biggest hurdles they're trying to get over as they're telling the story is they're trying to draw portraits, and they're trying to draw things too realistically, and the shading is much too sophisticated for a comic. And I keep saying, pull back. You don't have to push it that far. Not every panel is a masterpiece, nor should it be. It's just another step in the story. So tell that part of the story as convincingly as you can and move on, which is a hard thing for people to do, because they think everything has to be perfect. Every panel has to be a masterpiece.
Yeah, but that's an incredibly difficult lesson, don't you think?
It is. It absolutely is, because we tend to, especially as artists, before we gain our artistic discipline, we tend to look at the components rather than the whole. And we tend to focus on certain components rather than addressing the entirety. And that's what you have to do. As a comic artist, you have to address the whole page, and then you have to address the entire story. So if you get that hung up on one panel, you're doing it wrong. And you're not helping they call it continuity for a reason. The story has to flow, and it has to have a certain continuous flow, both artistically and rhythmically. And if it doesn't, it gets choppy, and you can lose the reader. So, I mean, there's parts of this craft that a lot of people don't think about, but it is definitely, it's more complicated than you think. When you sit down and read a comic and you read it in 7 minutes and then you throw it on the pile, yeah, I guess they did their job, right? I mean, that's what you're supposed to be able to read that story. It's supposed to be satisfying, in and out. But when you think about that, and then you overlay that on top of somebody sweating a single panel in a 22-page story, then you start to see the folly.
Well, and that's the thing that I think a lot of people have a hard time to grasp, that they think that, I mean, I'm coming from a writer's aspect, but the writer is literally 50%. It is not the overall. It's not the majority. You can set up a story, but it's the artist's, I would say, heavy burden to be able to project into the visual. Because I can write as many eloquent stories and prose as possible, but it is completely up to the artist and their interpretation to be able to make that dream fully realized. And I think that's, I will always respect artists because of the fact that that is an amazing skill to take something from somebody's mind that is just a bunch of words and create the visuals that draw the people in. Because let's face facts, it is the artist that brings in the readers. They may like what somebody writes, but if it is not drawn well, then the fail happens right there.
Well, the art is definitely the more immediate of the two sides of the storytelling. I mean, you don't have to invest as much in the art because it's there. It's you can't ignore it. You have to invest in the writing. You have to work your way into the story and actually read it. And that is, it's an investment of time and intellect. And sometimes you get a situation where the art is more satisfying than the story. Other times you get the sensation, or you get the feeling that the story is very satisfying, but the art didn't really hold up very well. A lot of times you don't really know the difference, and that may or may not be a good thing. But I've seen a lot of artists who really have done some disservice to the story that they were given by just through their own hubris. You know, they've decided that, oh, I can tell this better. Well, that might be true. But that's not your job, really. The writer's giving you the story to tell. You should tell that story, or else get on the phone and talk it over with them before you decide to make that unilateral change. Well,
and that's why I think personally that my job as a writer is a lot easier than the people who actually have to bring it to life visually.
Well, maybe from a time standpoint and you know, the physical investment, but at the same time, there's a lot of gray matter at work there.
Sure,
imagination that bring that story to life. I mean, I've been on both sides. I'm not a writer, but I've done my share of plotting, and I also did some editing, and I've seen it from both sides, and I really I kind of almost resent it when an artist decides that they know better. Now having said that, though, I've worked in the Marvel style. I did some projects, some books with Roy Thomas years back in the 90s when we did Hercules and Xena, and now Roy was working from the old Stan Lee synopsis approach, which I thought was amazing.
Well, I tell you what, let's go into that just real quick about the Marvel way.
Yeah, basically what you'd get from Roy, and this was Stan's old model, is in a paragraph, he'd tell you what was going on in each page. So you wouldn't get that sort of a script or screenplay type of a script. You would just get a paragraph saying, this is what's going on this page, and then the next page, this is what's going on. And then he basically leaves it up to the artist to pace it and flesh that story out. And what was always fun about that is you could kind of twist and mangle the story to your own ends a little bit, as long as it followed his synopsis, as long as the framework of his story was followed, he was fine with it. And then what he did with your drawings, he'd get the drawings and he'd go, oh, that would inspire him to maybe take the story slightly off his original path, or to come up with some inventive, creative, or humorous dialogue that your drawings might inspire. So it was really, that was a very liberating and very fun process. And
well, and I mean, even going a little bit deeper and diving, Neil Gaiman, brilliant writer, no doubt about it. But without people behind him like P. Craig Russell and Bill Sienkiewicz and Dave McKean, I don't think that would become an iconic reality like it has been.
Well, Craig Russell and I shared the same agent back in the 90s. Mike Friedrich, great guy. Craig Russell's a genius in my estimation. I just love that guy's artwork.
No argument there. When he did Salome, just brilliant. It didn't sell in the store, but I kept pushing it because I was like, you need to really read this. this is brilliance. And you know, that's I'd like to think that a lot of the fans have the ability to push those things that they like, and you know, regardless if there are chinks in the armor, if it's an ultimately pleasurable experience, like Bill Willingham when he was on Elementals, or Matt Wagner when he was doing Grendel. I mean, there was some brilliant stuff there, and it was just all the whole feedback of, well, you know, I really don't know about this or that. It's like, if you don't take the risk, if you don't spend a little bit of time and at least take the chance on, well, back then, you know, it was $2 for a comic, so you'd be okay with it. But I know I have to roll into this because this was a question that was asked more than once. I have a very loyal fan out there named Wild Fox Appears, and he asks about how much do you charge for commissions, and would you be willing to hear a rando on doing a story for a publication? Now, this brings up a complete Pandora's box, because I did want to get into the fact about commissions. And for me, this is very close to my heart because I am very close to a lot of incredibly good artists that are online right now. Matter of fact, just for a little shameless plug, Blackout by Dawn, Final Blackout, and Diddy do some incredible work. Please check them out on their channel. Sub to them right now. It only takes you 20 seconds. Also, Optic Decay, who is an amazing artist as well. He does his commissions too. And now, basically setting this up, basically Optic has worked for the comics industry. He became disillusioned and left. And so he's doing, yeah, and he's doing his own gig. He's doing his own thing. He gets commissions all the time. Matter of fact, there's a lot of YouTube people who are like, I need you to make me an avatar. I need you to make me, you know, a banner, an ad card, and people that I consider my friends, Blackout and Diddy. They are incredible artists, and they have their own personal styles that are amazing. They're starting to get commissions, but here's the thing. They have a problem with valuing what they do. And that leads into my big question. Literally, how, because honestly, how you charge your commissions would be a completely different story. But I do want to make sure that you can provide some framework for them to say, you know, what is your value? And I think that's incredibly helpful. I mean, if you want, you can go into what you charge for your commissions. I would love to have you do something for me, but I can never afford you. I already know that up front. But I mean, these are people who really need the education and a hand holding.
Well, that's always a tough question. Valuing yourself and what you do, really, in some respects, it's sort of two-pronged. It's how much time do you spend doing it, and what is your time worth? I value my time teaching is a little bit different than the time that I spend doing artwork. Sure. So if I have to put a monetary value on each, it's sort of a different thing. But to me, one of the first things you got to do is you have to be real honest with yourself. And one of the first questions I ask is, am I working quickly enough with enough quality to attach a certain monetary figure to my hours that I'm spending? So, for instance, if you think that you're worth charging, I don't know, $20 an hour to do a, I don't know, a figure drawing that might take you 3 hours, then it's, you know, a character drawing or something like that. So $60, is that worth it to you? That's what you have to kind of equate the amount of time you spend on these things to the amount that you're going to receive for it. Then you also have to take into account if you have to replenish supplies. I mean, that's a smaller kind of a thing, but you have to think about it as a business person. What is your time worth to you? Now, this gets a little bit touchier if you're somebody that takes a long time to do a commission. And I have friends who are really, really slow, but they produce amazing things. That enters into it, because if you were just naturally slower, does the commissioner, the person who's buying the artwork, do they really have to pay for that? Is that fair? So this is something that enters into it too. On the other hand, if you're really quick, that becomes a factor too, because if you're doing really good work, really high quality stuff that's in demand, and that's another factor too, the in-demand part of it, and you're popping these things out at a high quality at a pretty good pace, you're just making a lot more money, which is that's another thing to consider too. So it really does. I mean, it's nuts and bolts. You really have to kind of look at the amount of time you spend, and you have to keep track of the amount of time you spend, and you have to try to find that balance. What's your time worth to you, especially if you're doing this for a living? And I know people that do commissions for a living. Very few people are making a lot of money doing it. So usually you have to have some sort of supplemental income. But if you're going down that path, you have to increase your speed and keep your quality at a high level in order to increase the demand for your work. So that's going to be huge. Now, if you're just starting out, or if you're just kind of getting your feet wet in the commission area, it's going to be tougher to build a client base if you're given really ridiculously high prices. Now, if you're doing a single figure on 11 by 17, and you're inking it perhaps with marker, so just black and white drawing, and you want to charge anywhere from $60 to $125, I think that's fair in the realm of anybody who's doing some pretty good work out there. Now, if you're really well known and there's a lot of demand for your work, sky's the limit. It's basically whatever the market's going to bear. And you learn that in a hurry, especially if you have a commission list that's, in the dozens, and you're having a hard time keeping on top of it. That means your demand is pretty high, and therefore you can possibly afford to charge a little bit more.
And do you mind if we kind of deep dive a little bit? Because sure. That Green Hornet cover is amazing.
Thank you.
Would you mind breaking that down for me?
Okay, so I don't have a set price list because I do a lot of different kinds of things, but that's a good one to talk about because it is a type of commission that I do, and that is a reimagined cover, or a cover that never was, that I like to call them, where I have clients that keep coming back, and some of them are actually in competition with each other now to come up with a more interesting idea, which is fun. But for me, I don't like to charge astronomical prices because I will lose my clients. So
sure.
But astronomical is a relative term because my prices might sound a lot to some people. They might not sound like much to others. But for a piece like that, the black and white artwork for a cover with that kind of detail on, that would be, a penciled and inked version on an 11 by 17 piece of paper. That can go anywhere for me from $400 to $600.
Okay.
And so I'm aiming it at a certain area. Part of that is nostalgia. A lot of the people that commission my artwork are middle-aged. They grew up with my work. They are in the middle of their professional lives, and they have some discretionary income. In order for it to be worth my while, I have to charge some of these things take me a little bit longer, and I should probably charge more for them. But because I like to do these things, and it is on the side because I do have a day gig, so to speak. I'm pretty comfortable with that range. Now, if I'm coloring it, then the price obviously goes up.
See, I was honestly going to say, I wanted to say this before you even started into it, that I was thinking 800 to a K.
There, depending on what I'm doing, it can get up that high. This piece colored would probably have been in the $800 range. So paintings, I don't do a painting for less than $1,200. So it depends on the amount, and obviously the amount of what kind of subject matter, and if it's a ridiculous amount of detail. I've done a couple of these covers, these types of commissions that only had a couple of figures and there was very little detail on them. And I've really cut the price back because to me, it's just fair. And the nice thing about that is a lot of times the client or the commissioner will look at that and say, well, gee, that was great. Maybe I could get another one done. And that's worked out really well for me. I've had a lot of repeat customers come and ask for commissions, and which is awesome. The other thing that you got to realize is there's a whole lot of people out there, and this is the tough pill to swallow, who do not understand pricing at all. And they do not understand that artists take time to create this stuff. And there are even some people that think that you're just sitting there waiting to do them artwork for free. So you have to be very, very careful to disabuse them of that sort of thinking. I was, a few years ago, I was commissioned by a fellow, and when I gave him, and I didn't think it was that, I think that was a $500 quote, and he was totally aghast. And I read back the request, basically the art suggestion, which was fairly involved, and he was still like almost offended that I would quote that much. And I said, no, may I ask what you do for a living? And he said, well, I'm a lawyer. And I said, okay, how much do you charge per hour? And he went, oh, okay. See, he wasn't looking at it at all. He thought, in his mind, I was a starving artist who was just sitting here waiting for somebody to bestow a job upon me, and
yeah.
It was put to him that, no, this is what I do for a living, part of what I do for a living. And then all of a sudden it dawned on, and this is an intelligent person, but you can see where the problem comes in. Some people just don't always put it together the way you hope they would.
Well, and there's a lot, and I have to say youngsters, because I'm close to your age. There's a lot of 20-year-olds, mid-20-year-olds that are out there that can't seem to find value in what they do. Mm-hmm. And so they're incredibly confused. I mean, I can list off just an amazing amount of artists that I have run into that do some great material, but they have a hard time reinforcing their personal value. Diddy's one, Blackout is one, a friend of mine, Lord Byron. These guys do some amazing stuff. They do it fast. They do it proficient. But and I ran it. I had an argument today with Diddy, who just felt like she wasn't worth more than somebody paying $20 for what she does. And some of the stuff that she does is, let me compare this. She is close to, who Colleen Dornan is, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. She is on her level. And she only charges $15 or $20. For doing full color.
Figure?
Digitals, yeah. Full color figure digitals.
Oh, okay. Well,
and I believe she definitely has more value than that. And it's really hard trying to convince these people because they're thinking two different things. They're thinking about walking into an industry being fresh, and they're thinking about their personal worth internally. What can you respond to on those 2 points?
I think that if you are creating something and it's yours, as long as you're not copying somebody else's artwork. Maybe you're aping a style. That's different. But if you're creating something and it's your talent on display, that's worth something. And this is a hard thing, especially for young artists, to kind of wrap their head around, because we all have this thing. I mentioned it before. It's called the imposter complex.
Mm-hmm.
We all doubt ourselves. The fact of the matter is, if somebody is willing to give you money to produce a piece of artwork, it's up to you to put a value on that artwork, because they won't. The customer will always, and rightly so, try to get whatever they can for the least amount of money. So you have to decide for yourself, what's the basement, what's the bottom, the bare bones amount that you'll accept. And that's why, and this is tough too. You have to think in terms of very practical, business-like themes here. How long did it take me, and what is my time worth? And then as you get going and you build a clientele or you become more well-known, your fame or your marketability becomes part of the equation too. When you're just starting out and your name, and if you don't have a long resume or a body of work to buttress your quote unquote fame, then it does become a little bit more difficult to value your work higher. But I would certainly say, if you're doing something, for instance, that takes you an hour to do, ask yourself, if you were doing anything else, would you take that amount for digging a ditch? Would you take that amount for, hammering 2x4s together? Because it's all work. And if you wouldn't take, $20 an hour for digging a ditch, you darn well shouldn't take $20 an hour for drawing a really nice picture. I would say you really do have to kind of look at it on those terms. What is your time worth to you? And what is your talent worth to you? They are buying this because of your talent. So that factors into it too. So there has to be a ground level. There has to be a floor to what you'll accept. And as you go, you have to be able to inch that floor up as you get better and as you become more marketable and better known.
And that's incredibly succinct. And taking it from somebody who is an actual artist who does commissions, and not from some guy who runs a stream behind a bandage, I think that's something that hopefully the people out there listening right now will take to heart, because you find value within yourself, and you need to find value within the things you do, and those two things connect. And that's where you need to find the ultimate value. John Doe has asked, do you think the collector art world ruins art itself?
Are we talking about comic collecting art?
I'm gonna go ahead and define it and say yes.
Okay. I'll tell you, there's a couple of trends that I'm not real fond of. There's a lot of people out there at comic shows who are just starting out, and that's great. I think that there's always room for more fish in the pond, and I think that's an awesome thing. You got to start someplace. You got to get noticed. We all have been through that. If you have a goal to work in this industry in some way, shape, or form, I think it's a great time, because there's so many opportunities to self-publish now, or to go to small publishing, or to do it online even. So yeah, get out there, get your stuff seen at shows, and do artwork to kind of broaden your marketability out there. One of the things that bothers me is that there's so many illustrators that, and some are pretty good and some are really bad, who show up at the comic shows these days and sell their work because they've attached it, or they're copying the styles of other people who have made a name in the industry, or they're just using those characters. And these people have never worked a day in the industry. and yet they're out there kind of making some kind of a living off of the backs of others. I don't really agree with that. I have some trouble with that.
I'm completely with you on that.
Pardon?
I'm completely with you on that.
Yeah, some of the stuff, I think to myself, boy, a lot of these people are good enough that they should make a run or make a go of it. But it's become sort of an art fair, kind of a circus out there. And what I don't appreciate, and this might sound self-serving, but I actually look at other, excuse me, I look at other artists who have slaved in the industry who are sitting at these shows and not getting a lot of attention. And I think, now, wait a minute, you should be over there buying this person's stuff rather than somebody just because they've got a flashy, print of Spider-Man. Who are these people? And, why are they here? Because they're here because they're attaching themselves to a kind of a gravy train that they don't necessarily deserve to be on. And that's my opinion. I know some people would disagree with me, but as in terms of, younger artists breaking in, you got to get out there and you got to show your stuff. But if you're in it to make a name for yourself in the industry, whether it's with an established publisher or, like I said, if you're self-publishing, absolutely get out there and throw your hat into the ring and do as much of this stuff as you can. So I think that's how you market yourself, and that's only natural.
Well, and to parallel this, I ran into Dennis Cowan. At the time, he was an incredibly young artist. He was doing The Question.
Yes.
And brilliant stuff. I mean, amazing, great noir, even with color, great noir stuff that he was drawing. And his booth was almost completely empty because everybody else wanted to. I think at the time it was hooking up with John Byrne or Bill Sienkiewicz. I think McFarlane was there that year, but I mean, I came up and he was doing sketches for like $20. And I'm like, I told him, I was like, I can't believe that you're charging this much. And he's like, what, you think it's too much? And I was like, no, I think it's too little. Because the stuff that you do is amazing and it's brilliant. And if people don't see that, that's their own damn fault. The people that are coming up to you are going to be those people that already appreciate your art. And you need to get paid in perspective as to what you're doing, as to how much joy and pleasure that you bring other people. And I mean, let's throw writers out of it, because writers, I mean, you never really get it right. I mean, they write it, but the people that bring it to life are the actual artists. And the artists are literally, to me, the unsung heroes.
Oh, I don't know. They're pretty sung.
Well, now they are, but when you were starting off, and we're going to jump right back into this. Now, I was already hooked up because I lived in Ohio at the time. And I was hooked up with Capitol. They were distributors at that point.
Yep.
Before Diamond City came in and just crushed everybody out. And anytime they introduced a Capitol-based comic, I was like, yes, we're going to get 5 copies of this, just because I'm already convinced on the quality. And we never had a problem selling out. Ever. As a matter of fact, we would have to reorder from them because of the fact that I only ordered 5 of each.
It's a great time for indie comics.
Yeah, I mean, and let's talk a little bit about the artists that have infiltrated into the system, because it was an amazing time. There were a lot of good art. There was a lot of good stories, and I think that helped to flesh it out to where it was definitely a wide open playground where you could tell any story from, an assassin to, Lazarus coming back from the grave and being a bad guy. I mean, all of this stuff was amazing. You could be literally a psychotic Vietnam veteran who was locked in a fucking tiger cage,
Right.
to somebody who had to maintain the cosmic balance. All of those were out there. Even things like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles came around at that time.
That's it. That's all the same period.
Yeah. And this was an amazing burgeoning time. And I am so interested in knowing what somebody on the inside was feeling at this time. I mean, was it, how liberating was it for you?
Oh, it was exciting as hell. I mean, you can't really, I can't explain the feeling, because as somebody that wanted to do comics from a very early age, here the opportunity was presented, and it was right in my hometown, which was weird. And the interesting thing for me was, as I was starting, I was still trying to kind of break in at one of the big two. And yet the industry was at a very, very interesting place where it was still towards the beginning stages of the direct sales approach to distribution in comics. And at the same time, you had this burgeoning wealth of talent out there that wanted to work in the industry, but the industry didn't support it. So something had to give. And that's when you started to see the smaller publishers. I mean, ElfQuest, that started back then too.
Oh,
and
yeah.
all of this stuff starts popping up, whether it was self-published or whether it was a side business like Capital City. You know, they were distributors. It was a natural trick to just go ahead and start to publish too, although that was hard.
Yeah, and First Comics and Eclipse.
Oh, yeah, yes, exactly. And then you had Dave Sim, who was doing Cerebus. You had George Freeman up in Canada doing Captain Canuck.
And can we say how amazing that run was?
Oh yeah, I know. And we're all looking at this stuff, going, "Boy, something's happening here." And I remember when Capital put Steve and Mike, or Mike and Steve, went to Capital, and they said, "Let's do this." And they started to do a Nexus, and that's when I started to feel like this is a possibility. I have to be connected with this. I didn't realize it was going to happen the way it did, but I figured it was probably kind of inevitable, because there weren't that many people around here doing that stuff back then. And I remember when Les Dorscheid came in and Rich Bruning said, "We got to look at what George Freeman is doing with the coloring." Because Freeman was doing Captain Canuck, and he was cell shading the entire comic on acetate. He was using cartoon colors on acetate, the way they used to do traditional animation.
Yeah.
And he was printing on regular newsprint, and it was looking awesome. And we were saying, wait a minute, he's doing full 4-color separations on this stuff. Why can't we? And so, Les and Rich, they put their heads together, and they kind of learned from what George was doing. And if you look at those early Badger issues and Nexus issues, there's some pretty sophisticated color. Now, granted, there's probably a lot of mistakes there too, but we were all learning, and things were changing so quickly. And if you remember, right around the same time, the big players, Marvel and DC, they were going to the flexographic press. Do you remember this?
Oh, yeah.
And with the paper plates rather than the metal plates, and you get these weird squiggly ink lines, and the color they started printing on white newsprint, and that looked weird. The color looked like Bazooka Joe kind of coloring, and
exactly.
Comics started to look weird. And here over in the independent press, comics were starting to look more sophisticated. And so it's almost like they were giving us they're kind of giving us a head start, or a way to catch up to them. And then, of course, like I said, you had Sim doing Cerebus, which was brilliant, and nobody else is doing anything like that back then. And yet there's so many of us had also been kind of loosely brought up on the underground comics of the late 60s and the early 70s. And we were sitting there going, well, why can't we get a little bit more adult or sophisticated? Why can't we push our stories and our art? For me, this sounds kind of goofy, but I remember when Mike started talking about, when this guy hits someone, a Badger hits somebody, it's got to hurt. And I grew up, like I said, my dad was a sports writer. I was always interested in sports. He had these great old boxing books. And I used to look through them, and you would see these great shots, like I think there's a famous shot of Rocky Marciano tagging, I think it was Ezra Charles, or it might have been Jersey Joe Walcott. And it's just at the point of impact, and his face contorts in just an amazing way. And the sweat flies everywhere. And I thought, oh, that's it. When the Badger hits somebody, it's going to look like that. Of course, I took it to an extreme, and I'm still hearing about that to this day.
No. I think that's a lot of naysayers.
I
think there's a beautiful poetry in Badger's violence.
Well, and I had a lot of fun with it, because I thought to myself, well, this is a way that we're going to kind of make our mark, and maybe, get noticed a little bit above everything else was going on. I thought, listen, when I was in high school, I've gotten in fights. I know what this feels like. It's not fun to get hit, and if he's going to hit somebody, it's going to hurt. So that was the whole point of all of that. And
well, and I don't want to gloss over it at all, but you basically stopped doing Badger because you got the job for TSR.
Yes.
And I am just fascinated, completely fascinated by TSR. And I'll say this, I'm not shy about stating this. Playing Dungeons and Dragons, because kids, I don't know if you know this or not, there were no video games back then except for like Pong and maybe Star Trek and maybe some piece of crap on an 8-bit system that was way before SNES that helped fuel imaginations. And I honestly, I was rabid about the fact when I got the next, when I got the Dungeon Master's Guide, when I got the Player's Handbook, when I got the Fiend Folio, when I got the Monster Manuals, flipping through them and seeing those images, being able to crystallize them in my mind, you were responsible for that.
Well, partly. There was a lot of us.
Partly, there were quite a few good artists. Can you talk a little bit about that particular bullpen?
Yeah, that bullpen was it was a pretty heady experience going into that, as I mentioned before. The first person everybody talks about is Larry Elmore. He seems to be the most well-known, very talented guy.
Elmore's good, you got to admit. Yeah.
Yeah. We were all in the same room, which is so amazing. I was right next to the door. Larry was off to my right. Right next to me was Jeff Easley, who I consider to be one of the most all-around talented people I've ever met. Good
God, yes.
Oh, and the nicest guy. And anybody that's ever met Jeff before, if they just know him in passing, he's such a quiet, unassuming guy. But they don't realize how funny he is. And I got to sit next to him for 5 years. And my only regret is that I didn't write down everything he said, because this guy has one of the quickest wits of anybody I've ever met. And he's just hilarious. But, and you wouldn't know it to meet him. But he can draw, he can paint, he can sculpt. He is, again, quite a Renaissance man.
I was going to say, because I met him at a Gen Con once, and he was very reserved.
Yeah, very quiet. People can't believe when I say that. Is it Jeff? And oh yeah, Jeff. Then Clyde Caldwell, who Clyde kind of came from almost sort of a Boris approach to painting. His stuff was a lot slicker looking. Where Jeff had a very visceral style. Larry's was a little bit more stylized and personal to him. And then of course we had Keith Parkinson. The late Keith Parkinson, he passed away, I think, in 2005. Keith and I were the young Turks in the art department. We were both the same age, and he was poised to become something amazing, and he was still kind of working towards that point. And it kind of happened during that time when we were all together. Then Dave LaForce, who is known by his pen name, and that's Diesel. He was a mapper and an artist, and you still see him at all gaming conventions and I get to see him every year at Gary Con down in Lake Geneva. And he was a great guy, still is. But it was an amazing group of extremely talented people. And what I'll always remember was how everybody got along. Everybody had egos. I mean, we all had artistic egos, and we were all pretty good at what we did. It's just that we all got along. And there wasn't that sort of cattiness that you would think would go along with a group of really talented artistic.
I would think that kind of helped fuel the fire when somebody would be done with something. Go, hey guys, check this out. And you're like, oh, I got to do that better.
Oh yeah, there was definitely that quiet competition all the time. One story I tell a lot was Keith. Keith was probably the most intuitive colorist in the group. I mean, they were all painters, and yet I don't know that anybody was confident in their ability to handle color. And I think that's that imposter complex again. But Keith had just this sort of, innate confidence about his use of color. And whenever he'd get up, take a break to go take a leak or something, which the bathroom was, we were in our own little studio. And we were kind of set apart from the rest of the company in a way. And Keith would leave, and we'd all get up and go over to his cube and look at his palette, because we couldn't figure out how those muddy-looking crap colors on his palette were looking so beautiful on the canvas. And it was really like being in school to see how sophisticated his approach to color mixing was. And we would all learn from it. And I remember when I had been hired as a black and white artist, basically to do module interiors, line art. And they were just like, well, you can paint, can't you? And I'm like, well, yeah. And they threw the box art for the Conan game in my lap. And I'm like, wait a minute. I don't know if I'm ready for this. And I remember Larry said, when will you be ready? Just do it. And I just recall getting so many tips and so much support from these guys when I was basically doing my first real painted illustrated cover. And it was for such a high profile game.
Well, so I do have to say it was a shitty game, but great art.
Well, I tell you, we went on after that and did, one of my favorite line art projects was for a Conan game where I penciled all the illustrations and Jeff Easley inked them. And if you're familiar with the great old pulp artist Virgil Finlay, it looks like his artwork because Jeff got all pointillistic with it. I mean, this is what I mean about Jeff. Jeff can do anything well, and he's just one of those guys that you just put out in front of him and he just does a knockout job.
Brother, I bought it because of the art.
Yeah, we had a lot. That was pretty heady stuff. The other thing that, and I suspect this is why Jim Rosloff hired me at the time, but I didn't know, is that they had the license for the Marvel Superheroes role-playing game. And I think that they were getting two for the price of one, because I could do the fantasy stuff, but I could also do the superhero stuff. And then I became the principal artist for that game, which was, again, talk about, I had to keep saying, my God, they're paying me to do this. This is amazing.
Can we say that the Wolverine that you did was phenomenal? I mean, yeah.
Oh, yeah, that was fun.
I mean, you can't fool yourself. There's brilliance in those in those covers. That sold more books than they would have sold.
That was like I said, when they told me that I was going to get to do a series of paperback cover paintings of the Marvel characters, I think they had to reel my jaw back up to my mouth, because I was just so amazed. I thought, this is what I always wanted to do. There was a book that came out, I think in 1967, a paperback book called The Great Gold Steal. And it had a wonderful Mitchell Hooks cover of Captain America painting. Mitchell Hooks was a really well-known commercial illustrator at the time. In fact, he had done a couple of the 007 James Bond movie posters. But he didn't sign this thing. And it was this wonderful illustration of Captain America standing there heroically with holding his shield and a ray gun. on this paperback book cover. And I remember being about 9 or 10 years old, and I saw this book, and I told my mom, I want to do this someday. So the first Marvel cover painting I did was an homage to that painting. And I just said, I have to say thank you to Mitchell Hook some way or another, because that helped to put me on the path. That and all of the wonderful Frazetta paperback covers, and James Bama covers for Doc Savage.
Oh, yeah, I'm a big fan of Doc Savage, even though nobody knows who the hell that is anymore.
Yeah, that's frightening. Nobody knows who Frazetta is anymore. That's scary. My students, I ask my students, and they all look at me blank stared, and I'm like, oh my gosh.
Well, or Boris or the Brothers Hildebrand.
Yep.
I mean, these were amazing artists, and it just seems, I hate to say it, but it seems like a force-fed society to where they don't respect what came before. They just want to know what's next. There's the Wolverine cover. And that thing is bloody amazing.
I remember Keith Parkinson was known for doing these wonderful panoramic vistas, these great landscapes, and Larry Elmore did them too. I remember when I did
the Fantastic Four one too, by the way.
Oh yeah, thank you. I remember when I did that Wolverine, and Keith and Larry came up to me and they were like, "Good background, dude." And that's when I knew I made it. You know, I got complimented by those guys. That one's my wife, by the way. That was that Muka.
That's brilliance. I mean, see, the thing is, I think a lot of people have lost perspective, and I guess we might as well just jump into this right now. I really do want to hear more about your journey, but I've had a lot of people comment to me, oh, and you know, there's one of my inspirations for my character.
Oh yeah.
But I do want to jump into this because the comic industry has changed quite a bit, and it's no longer a meritocracy. I'm not a political guy, but I suffer because the thing that I love that gave me the onus to be able to write, to be able to have my imagination, to my fantasies, when I was a stuttering little kid who couldn't put more than 3 words together. And now there are people trying to push a political agenda rather than, you know, basically, here's a bad guy, here's a good guy. I'm really, really curious as to your thoughts on how this has actually changed, that this has become more of a platform than an expression.
Well, I struggle with that a little bit because I see it it's happening all over the place, which is what's a little disconcerting to me is that once, and I've always tried to stay out of this as much as I can, because I've always felt that on the main level of what I do, I'm supposed to be entertaining. I've always felt there's a time and a place where you can offer opinion and you can preach your position. It doesn't necessarily have to be when you're trying to entertain somebody. You can craft a moral to a story. You can craft a message within the story. But I think there's a fine line between that and preaching. And I think sometimes when you cross that line, you start to lose your audience. And I think, well, that's counter to what we're supposed to be doing. You're supposed to be expanding your audience. And I think it's all too easy sometimes to forget that and just assume that you're in an echo chamber, that everybody wants to hear what you have to say. And to a certain degree, I think social media kind of propagates that idea. I think, you know, we get out there, we all feel in some way, just like right here, you know, that we're talking to, you know, a certain number of people. There's a certain amount of sort of faux fame attached to that. And therefore, obviously, if I'm saying something, somebody might want to hear about it. But by the same token, we're talking about shared interests, and we're talking about, you know, shared stories of our youth or things that we all have in common. That brings us together. I think that when you start to preach, especially in an entertainment medium, I think you start to push things apart, and I don't particularly agree with that. I think that's contrary to the mission of entertaining.
I cannot disagree with that. I mean, because storytellers throughout time have basically told the good versus evil, and to take a political platform incredibly disrespects those classic storytellers, because there has to be some type of distinction. There has to be a good versus evil. There has to be, well, the good guy may lose the first fight, but he never gives up, and he still has to plunge forward to meet to that ultimate goal. And I mean, the SJW comic books are killing me, just because of the fact that they're killing the industry that I love. They're killing the industry that literally sparked my imagination, that made me be creative, that gave me the onus to say, yes, the world is an open playground and it's time to play. I may not be the best regarded writer around, I never claimed to be, but I love to tell those stories about how good suffers but overcomes the evil in the end. And I think that's what's missed with the current comic books, because they talk way too much about safe spaces, talk about accommodating to minorities. The whole thing about it is that a hero fights for everyone. There is no color, there is no race, there is no gender. And by the way, that's an awesome surfing cover. I wish that would have come up.
Yeah,
that was amazing. And it's so funny. Just a sidetrack here for a second. I showed a few friends of mine who are artists scrolls of what I was putting up, and they're like, "You've got to be kidding me! This guy did this," and it's like, "Yeah, and this, and this, and this. This is what an artist does." And they were just like, "That's amazing! I have to up my game." And
up your game.
Without you even being around, you've inspired people.
Oh, that's nice to hear.
And yes, if people haven't checked it out, I don't know if they had actually put it into a compendium or a trade paperback yet, but go seek out the Green Hornet. Go seek out the first few issues of Badger. There's some amazing art in there. You will not be disappointed. If you are disappointed, then you know what? You guys have my open DMs. You can confront me personally, but I will take this cover right up front. This is amazing art. This is amazing storytelling. And this is something that is lacking in the current comic book product. And you will not have any regrets if you go back and you check some of this stuff out. It's comic books are timeless. They may be a little anachronistic. They may be a little bit dated. But when it comes down to it, if you're there for the triumph over the tragedy, then where else do you need to look? Comic books are our modern day mythos. Yes. They are the things that drive us, the things that inspire us. And I know nobody's ever going to go back and read the Iliad. So you might as well check out comic books. And I don't mean, I apologize if I'm acting like a dick writer, but the things that you have done have been important to help the progression of the comic book story. I mean, oh God, I just saw the Godzilla thing too. That is amazing. Even the stuff that you did for the horror comics. Everybody can step back and say, damn, that's beautiful. There's a visceral feeling to it. There's an engagement to it. And I think, honestly, that's something missing from current day comics. Now, I know you said that you don't really keep up with the current comics, but I mean, is there any book that you still follow?
Well, I have to tell you, one of my favorite comics of the last 20 years is Mike Mignola's Hellboy.
Oh, God.
And yes. I remember meeting Mike years ago down in a show in Chicago when he was just starting. Just the very, very beginning of Hellboy. Mark Nelson and I hung out with him one night. We were eating hot dogs at the street vendor and talking about comics. And he was showing us some of those early pages. And I remember the visceral feeling I got when I saw what he was doing. And I thought, wow, here's a guy that is taking a step forward by taking a step back. And you could tell he had made a conscious decision. And I know this happened around the time he was doing the Dracula movie adaptation, where he was starting to say, listen, detail isn't the thing. Detail is almost not even part of the story. It's about the lights and the darks. It's about the light and shadow.
It's the tone. It's the noir.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, he was hitting on something that inspired everybody. I mean, the stories. I love the stories because they're small stories, and I have to say, and I'm not saying that this is my opinion. I'm not trying to, I'm not trying to say something is wrong necessarily. But when mainstream comics lost me is when they decided to go with the corporate story approach. Not that I'm anti-corporation, but the whole point was I liked small stories. I like a storyline or a story arc that maybe hung together over the course of 3 or 4 issues and then resolved itself with threads leading to a new story to pull you along. I didn't understand the need for all of these hyper crossover things that went on all summer long and were so convoluted. And to me, it sort of was antithetical to the whole notion of storytelling, because the writers weren't telling the stories. These were corporate decisions that were handed down in a boardroom and said, this is what we have to do. Now write the story. And and this is why I get back to Mignola and comics like that. They're small. There's a passion in there that you can't find anywhere else. I remember, when Mike started to get into the whole occult and the whole, otherworldly stuff and the religious symbolism, and it all came together so beautifully. And the whole idea of this demon from hell being brought up to be a good guy, I mean, it gets back to that whole notion of where Superman, had he been raised in Soviet Russia or whatever, how would he have been different? I mean, it hit me on so many different levels. Obviously, a lot of people on so many different levels, and I couldn't put it down. I couldn't get enough of it. And so that's a book and a character that stuck with me for all of these years, because I think it's brilliant.
And honestly, to be completely transparent, Mike Mignola was one of the first people that I actually asked to come on to the show.
Really?
And he flat out rejects everybody.
Yeah.
He told me FO in a very polite way, and I was cool with that because of the fact that as far as transitions go, I can't see anybody that bridges the gap better to Will Eisner than Mike Mignola.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, you got Eisner, you got Toth, you've got all of the guys that were Noel Sickles, the guy that essentially inspired, Terry and the Pirates, and Kniff and all of that came after that. And that spiders out into virtually all of the great comic artists and cartoonists of the greatest generation. So, you know, Mignola's work, he's standing on the shoulders of giants, but he made it his own. And that's the really incredible thing about it.
Yeah, there is brilliance behind what he does. People have criticized him for being a minimalist, and it's like, I don't think you really understand what he's doing with the panels. Sit back. You know what? Take a jar of whiteout and just go over the word balloons and sit back and see if you can understand the story. And you certainly can.
Oh, sure.
And that's the amazing part. I mean, that's the thing I don't think artists get enough praise for, is the fact that you guys basically, you will visualize what has been verbalized, but in a better way.
Well, that's the job. But what's so, I thought, amazing about Mike's work, like I said, there's a passion involved there that a lot of times when you get really personal, or you get very passionate about your personal hobbies or interests, and you write and tell the story about them, it's not always accessible. But that's what I thought was so amazing about what he was doing with Hellboy, because all of those little quirky passions that he had for history and for the occult and for, like I said, religious symbolism and noir, all of that came together in such a special way. And you don't see that happen that often in any medium, you know, in film or TV. You know, when it happens, it's special. And that's why I have a lot of respect for his work.
And I know recently, this is just a sidebar, I know recently they have started reissuing Hellboy in trade paperbacks and compendiums. If you have not read Hellboy, you owe it to yourself to do so, especially if you are someone who wants to get into this field. You need to understand that there is no such thing as a trope, that there is tradition. And that tradition is carried on. And somebody like Mike Mignola has done his best to carry on that tradition.
Yes. And make it his own. Put his own stamp on
it. He put his spin on it, but you can tell that there are the footprints of the people who came before him. And that's what makes it amazing. And that's what makes your art amazing too. Let's not disrespect it.
Did I show you this?
Oh, very nice.
Make his head as big as mine.
And his eyes are glowing too.
Yeah. Yeah, this is the other fun stuff that I do. Oh, here's for the D&D fans.
Now this is legitimately his 3D sculpts.
Yep. Yeah, these are little busts. Actually, a lot of these start out as demos for my my sculpting class. Here, I showed you.
You got to tell the story of the badger.
There's the badger right there. It's this. I don't know how well you can see that, but this guy is. Let's see if I can get some light on him. He is. Well, you can see by scale. Like
that's good.
He's fairly small, but he's got some, some pretty good detail in him. But he is inspired by the old Marx plastic figures from the 50s and 60s that were about 6 inches tall. And Mike Barron asked me to do a badger figure, and I didn't have a lot of time, so I did a tiny one. He got mad at me because he was so small.
Okay, well, let's get some ones in the chat for those who are old enough to remember Mark's figures, because I know I collected the shit out of them.
Oh, yeah. So I'm back in school, because I walked away from college to do the badger. And at 60, I went back And last spring, I decided to go back and finish off my art degree. And I've got 4 more credits this fall to finish up. But this summer, I had to take a couple of science classes, and I went back and took what had been a favorite was anthropology class. And so I was inspired to do a little Neanderthal bust.
Very nice.
And he's still in progress, but I'm having some fun with him too.
Well, and let's jump into that. How important was it for you to come back and get your education?
Well, it was important because I promised my parents I would, and they're both gone now. And so somewhere they're smiling. I always intended to finish, but the career just kept on taking me down different paths. And I went from the Badger to TSR, back into comics for about 10 years, and then into video game art for 15 years. And now that I'm teaching and I had a little bit of time on my hand, my father-in-law said, what do you think? Isn't it about time? I mean, you're not getting any younger, which is true. And I thought, wow, what would it take? So I went back and I talked to an advisor up there, and I'll tell you what, they were so nice, and they've welcomed me back. They wrote an article in the alumni magazine. They called me. This is part of it too. They wanted to do a feature on me on Wisconsin, which is the alumni University Alumni magazine. And I said, guys, I'm technically not an alum. And they said, oh, we consider you one of ours. So that kind of provided a little impetus too. And so I went back and I checked out how many credits I needed to finish. It was only 25. And so I took 15. I went full time last spring, and I got straight A's, which was a new experience for me. Then I took the 2 science classes this summer, and I got 2 A's. And in my anthropology class, I got 100% for the whole class.
Nice.
And then I took an entomology class, and I got 97.25%. So I felt pretty good about that too.
Nice.
And now, which is really interesting, I think some of your listeners might be aware of Linda Barry, who is a famous cartoonist. She did a syndicated strip that was in a lot of alternative newspapers for about 30 years. She used to be on David Letterman all the time back in the 80s. But she is a professor at the university. She teaches a class called Making Comics. And the advisor snuck me into her class with her permission. I mean, it's one of the most waitlisted classes at the University of Wisconsin, and it's very hard to get into. And they stuck me in because of my background. I felt a little bad about that, but I didn't feel that bad. And I studied with Linda last semester, and it was an incredibly emotional, satisfying, inspiring semester working with Linda. She took me down creative paths I've never been down before. I'm using some of her methodology in my own teaching now. And so this fall, she allowed me to do an independent study project with her coming up in the fall. So that's how I'm going to finish. I got to design my own cherry on top, as it were. So we'll be finishing up and graduating in December. Finally, like I said, my parents are smiling someplace.
That's amazing. And I mean, you're never too late for your education. And I will be honest with you, I would think that if you didn't do something like this, it would be a lot of talent wasted, because you have so much experience. And we'll get into the video game thing in just a minute. But everything, you've walked the path. You literally have done everything that a regular conceptual artist would have done. And you've come out on top. It would have been nice if you would have got a nice solid Marvel or DC run, but I do not think in any way that detracts from what you have done, because there are a lot of people in DC and Marvel, especially right now, that have not been able to cover the accomplishments that you have done. And there are way more people that cannot figure their way out of the damn box than taking an established character and messing it up. Whereas you've had the opportunity to take a fresh character, make them lively, and make them presentable. And I believe that is an amazing talent. And I think that's something that you should really be incredibly proud about.
Well, I'm extremely proud of my career. When you go through it, it's interesting. You don't always realize how important certain decisions are, or how significant things that you've done are, until they're reflected back at you by people who experienced them as a fan or as a consumer or as someone who was genuinely into the work that you were doing at the time. Because really, when you're doing it, it is work, and you have a passion for it, and you want to put forth your best work. I was lucky because I got to work on a lot of things that I love to do, and I got to do it kind of on my own terms. I mean, you talked about Marvel and DC. I auditioned at Marvel, and I got to know Jim Shooter a little bit at the time because I had shown him my portfolio, and he was impressed. And he wanted me to work at Marvel in the early 80s as an inker. And I didn't want to get pigeonholed. I'd seen friends who had gotten into the industry as inkers or letterers, and then they just got stuck as inkers and letterers or whatever it happened to be. And I wanted to do too many things, so I kind of shied away from it. And Shooter was, there are a lot of Jim Shooter stories out there. I cannot join that bandwagon because Jim Shooter was nothing but generous and a gentleman.
I have a personal experience with Jim Shooter too, and I will say that he was a stand-up guy.
Very, very. I'm telling you, I have nothing but good things to say about my experience with Jim Shooter. Then, also at Dick Giordano at DC, I was going to do a team book at DC.
Oh, dude, I tell you what, I'm sorry, I hate to interrupt.
That's okay.
Dick Giordano was awesome to me. I will say he gave me an opportunity no one else ever had, and I still kept the first paycheck that he sent me from DC. Dick Giordano was an amazing guy who recognized talent.
It's a class act, and he knew what he was doing. And I really enjoyed the time I spent with him. Unfortunately, the book that they had me slated to draw was canceled before it never took off. Let's put it that way.
Hook me up. What was it?
Do you remember the Impact line?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to do their team book for them.
Oh.
Which was the Impact version of their version of the Avengers, which would have been interesting. And it didn't. It was shelved for a while. Then I moved on to other things, and I think they actually ended up bringing it out, but it didn't last very long because the whole line didn't have the direction they were hoping, and so it didn't last long. That was the old Gold Key characters or heroes, and they're just they may have been a little bit too anachronistic for DC. I thought DC had an interesting idea with what they were going to do. It was sort of like what Marvel was doing with their sort of what was their otherworldly line that they were doing?
You mean with the Ultimates?
No, before the Ultimates. This is back in the 80s. They did.
Well, I'm thinking back to when DC did the Implosion.
Yeah,
where they introduced 21 different stories and had no focus whatsoever.
Right. Yeah. It was a kind of a weird time in comics, but I was happy to be getting that kind of attention. The nice thing is that I could always step back and I could find something interesting outside of Marvel and DC to do. And the most incredible part of it for me was while I was at TSR, I was essentially working for Marvel, and all of the stuff that I was doing for the Marvel game was going through their the editorial approval process, which was during the early days, which was terrible because they were having their assistant editors approve the artwork that we were sending through, and let's just say the approvals weren't terribly professional. And so they shuffled it up, and they started sending them all through the art director, who was John Romita Sr. Everything changed. And I got to tell you, talk about class act. John Romita,
hell yeah,
amazing, because back then we didn't have the internet. You'd have to Federal Express your artwork or a copy of the artwork out to him, and then he'd send back his suggestions. But you have to understand, John Romita Sr. is an amazing artist.
I have to interrupt you here. Too many people give him too much shit, and he is so amazing. If people would step back, especially with his Spider-Man run, oh my God, there's brilliance in that.
Yeah.
If I'm not mistaken, he's the one who did the Jackal run.
Yep. Yeah.
And you can't get any better than that. People are so looking towards flash and glamour to where, you know what? I don't think anybody else was able to pull the heartstrings better than he did with the whole Gwen Stacy thing.
Well, I got to tell you something. Do you know why this was? I was just having a conversation with a friend about this the other day. The reason that he was so good at that, and one of the reasons, he was just a great artist, and he was a really superb storyteller. He is a really superb storyteller.
Hell yeah.
But the thing is people don't realize, if you look at what John Romita Sr. was doing, other than the superhero stuff, he did some of the most beautiful romance comics ever.
Oh, and yeah.
That's something that an old comics fan would necessarily talk about. But as I've gotten older and I've gone back and researched and studied cartooning, you look at some of those old romance comics, some of the artwork in those things was just astonishingly good. And his stuff was gorgeous. And it's not just the artistic style. I know a lot of people quibble with his style, might be too cartoony, too minimal, whatever. But his storytelling is impeccable. And when you think about, Steve Ditko, obviously credited for co-creating Spider-Man, really putting him on the map, really creating an iconic character and a costume design and a pantheon of characters. John Romita Sr. is the guy that really put Spider-Man on the map. And he did it because, just as you said, he could tell a story. He could tug heartstrings. Those characters, this is why my brother loved it so much. You believed those characters existed, and you felt for them. And that, it's like when I talk about to my character design students, you always go back to the cartoonists and the animators, because they could do so much with so little. If you've got somebody that can create a little cartoon funny animal that can make you laugh and cry, you're dealing with some serious talent. And that's what we're talking about with artists like John Romita Sr.
Yeah, and he is amazing. Never. And that's the thing, is like, oh, well, it's a blocky style, blah, blah, blah. But did you enjoy the story?
Yeah.
Did you get into it? You know what? You can call people schlock artists, and I can call several people schlock artists, especially nowadays with the SJW stuff. But the thing is, if they were able to make you feel something, then either you're missing the depth, or you're just being blatant with, I just don't like it better than Todd McFarlane. That's wrong. That's so wrong. And I do have one of my favorite artists in the chat right now. He's an Aussie, so he just got up and he's interested in asking if Ethan Van Sciver and Super Frog's success is a success. Do you want to start your own comic?
Would I want to start my own comic?
Yeah,
I would love to. I have a couple of characters that have been percolating for a while, and I've actually talked to a writer friend about the possibility of getting together and fleshing one of these characters out, which I think is there's something. Every time I show somebody this character, they always like, "Oh my God, I would read that in a second." And,
oh, you're killing me! You're killing me.
Yeah, there is a very, very compelling concept attached to this thing, and I want to do it really bad, but I'd have to do it in a situation where I could actually, make money doing it, because it's going to take time.
Well, and there's been a lot, especially with people like Ethan Van Sciver, especially with damn it, I have to refer to him as diversity in comics, with the graphic novels that they've been coming out. People are there. They want to get those stories that they missed. They don't want the political bullshit. They really want to be entertained, and it's without any reservation that I say your illustrations have entertained people for over 3 decades, and I think that means something.
That's nice to hear.
I honestly would throw in, my pittance of a writer's ability to see that gets done for you, because I will be honest with you, you were one of the few people that I really wanted on here, so we could be able to immortalize the fact of the things that you do and the influence that you've had. And that's really hard for people to understand, the subtlety of those great artists that have been able to make an influence in the industry. So I'll get off my soapbox and re-ask the question: is there something that you really want to do, that you could be crowdfunded, that you could be sourced out with a GoFundMe, that you would really like to do and get underway? Because I tell you what, I would be one of the first people retweeting all over the damn place to get it done.
Well, absolutely. There's my first priority is I got to finish school, which is this fall. Looking ahead, there is a project that I mentioned that I'm dying to do. There's a couple others. During the slideshow, I don't know if you saw the animated character, the young Thor character. So another project that I have, that the only way I can describe it, and this isn't a very good description, but it would be the Norse gods kind of meet Archie. It's not quite that simple, but I don't know a better way to condense it into one. It's not literally meeting Archie. It's sort of like kind of teenage Norse god approach to sort of a universal story.
Well, I get it, and that's why I included it.
Pardon?
Because I think that's an amazing, just a schematic, just a setup. Because I think a lot of people think, oh well, somebody has an idea, boom, it's automatically a comic book. Boom, it's automatically an animated series. There's a lot of work that goes behind this.
Yep. Yeah, but the other one I was talking about before, the graphic novel project that I'd really like to do. I hate to describe it too much, but it is fleshed out, and it's to the point where, like I said, if I successfully hitch up with my writer friend, we actually put this thing together. That's something to think about over the next year, because it's definitely a story that needs to be told, in my opinion. I don't know if there's an audience, but I suspect so some people would get into it.
I am so there.
And what's interesting about it, without going into too much detail, is there's elements of it that, slightly harken back to the Badger. Not quite, but there's a little bit of that going on there. I mean, it's the kind of a character that can be played straight and can be played for comedic effect too. And those are the kind of stories. If it doesn't have humor in it, I'm not really all that interested. So it's got to have a little bit of everything.
Well, can I say, back in 1986, I met Dick Giordano, and he was amazing. He was the editor at that time.
Yep.
And he's an amazing guy. And I said, yeah, I'm kind of a writer. He's like, here's my business card. And I don't know if we have anything for you, And I wrote him back, and he said, okay, I tell you what, I'll give you this. Here are 4 characters, and I wrote for the Who's Who.
Oh, nice.
And if you know anything about Who's Who, there was no credit whatsoever given.
Oh, yeah, I know.
But I got $20 for every single one that I wrote. And I felt just amazing. I was on cloud 9. And I mean, I wrote for the shittiest characters available because, you know, already somebody else was writing. So, you know, I was writing for Brother Power Geek, for God's sake. And I mean, my skills, I don't think would be fitting to yours, but if it's ever there, I would certainly be happy to back you up because I really want to see more comic art from you.
Well, I'm interested in doing some more. As, you know, like I said, when there's a story that I really want to tell, it's going to be hard not to do it. So, but you mentioned not for credit or not getting credit. Here's one for people that are kind of old school video gamers. When I was working at Raven, and even then I was joined at the hip with Marvel because we did the X-Men Legends, 2 X-Men Legend game, and then followed that up with Marvel Ultimate Alliance.
Gotcha.
Which a lot of people think is one of the better Marvel games ever made. And I was the lead character.
I loved it.
I was the lead character on all 3 of those games. But here's something that people don't know because it wasn't credited. On Marvel Ultimate Alliance, the hub character of the game is Nick Fury. And so you always go back to Nick Fury to get your mission.
Yep.
And there's a few of us at Raven that used to be temporary voiceover, which was the placeholder stuff. We do it in-house with the director, and then he'd take that out to Hollywood. They would hire voiceover actors to actually do the actual VO, and they'd use our placeholder stuff to guide them. Well, when the voiceover actor that did Nick Fury, turns out they did a bunch of rewrites and he wasn't available. So our director, Bob Love, came in and said, we got a whole bunch of new lines for Nick Fury, but we don't have an actor. He said, so I want you to listen to this guy, listen to these files, and imitate his voice. So in Marvel Ultimate Alliance, there's about, about maybe a 5th or a 6th of what's in there. It's me, but you can't tell. And I didn't have a SAG card, so I didn't get credited.
Awesome. And that was one of my favorite games too.
It's a good game.
And let's jump into this because we're already hip deep. How did you get involved with doing 2D animation, with hooking up with the whole gaming circus?
Well, I moved back to Madison. I'd been living in the Milwaukee area and doing comics. And when we moved back, I remember I was going to do a job for DC. I was going to do a comic job for DC, and I got called by an editor, and I don't remember his name. I didn't recognize the person. And they said, what we really want you to do is we want you to draw this like Jim Lee. And I said, well, why don't you get Jim Lee to draw it? And he said, well, we can't really afford him. And I was like, okay, then no, thank you. I thought I had enough pride that I didn't want to be a lesser regarded Jim Lee at the time. And I thought, up until this point, I've been able to kind of do what I wanted in the comic book industry. And this was sort of a bad sign for me. And just because I could ape other people's styles, I didn't want to make a career out of it. And so
I'm just not a fan of Jim Lee anyway.
Well, and I had a friend, Les Dorscheid, who had been our colorist at Capitol Comics way back when, and we were old buddies. And he said he was working at Raven. And he said, why don't you come out here and see what we're up to? And so I did. And I ran into the art director at the local comic shop one day. And he asked if I'd be interested to interview. And I said, sure. So I went out and he sat and proceeded to show me all this wonderful stuff they were doing. And it wasn't 2D, it was 3D animation. They were starting to break into getting away from old 8-bit type computer games. And they were really starting to get into the next generation of full, you know, they're pretty boxy, but the early forms of 3D animated video games. And he was showing me all this stuff, and I said, "This is all great, but I don't know how to do any of this. Why would you want to hire me?" He said, and I'll never forget this. He said, "You don't understand. We want what you know. We want what you can do. This computer stuff, this is just like another brush to you. We can teach you this." And I was like, "Whoa, that was an interesting way to put it." And he was right. I took to it right away, and I jumped in and learned Photoshop and started to do all sorts of stuff, bringing what I had done. And these guys were all big TSR fans, so they were all gamers anyway. And so they were well aware of my work, and they wanted me to bring that to what they were doing. And the first game I worked on was Heretic 2, and I designed the main characters and did a lot of the concept work as well as texture work, and that launched the whole thing. From there, I think I worked on 11 AAA games over the next 13 years.
And how do you approach a video game as to how you approach doing 2D comics?
Well, it's interesting. It's a different kind of story because it's not linear. I used to teach video game art, and one of the things I used to chuckle, because most of the students come into it as gamers, and they don't realize that playing games is drastically different than developing games. You have to have a whole different approach to what you're doing. And you also have to accept the fact that in video games, you're not in control. The best video games make you feel like you're in control, but you're not. You're being led around, and you're being led around in a good game, in a compelling and immersive way. And that's one of those things, like I said, for somebody who's just getting into it, it's hard to wrap their mind around that it is so controlled. It's a very, very controlled situation. But
just like when Rockstar let Paul Dini do all the writing.
well, you could do worse. But the interesting thing about the video games, from day one, the challenge was space. I mean, when you think about it, we were, for years and years and years, we were trying to jam, 50 pounds of content onto a little disk that only held 5 pounds of information. And that was always the challenge. We always had to come up with ways to create the imagery that wasn't expensive in a digital information type of a way, because we only had so much room. And people would always say, "Wow, you guys can do just about anything." And I'd say, "No, we can't. We can only do as much as we can fit onto that little disk." And that was always the challenge. The technical challenge was, how do you make something look really good with very, very little information carrying that image? So it was always quite an interesting time merging people who aren't visual, generally speaking, meaning the programmers, with the visual people who weren't that technical, and that would be the artists. That's not always a match made in heaven, but we seem to make it work more often than not.
And I'll be honest, I do not have the brain to get from 2D to actual digital animation. What was that like as far as a jump for you? Because I'm guessing that this must be some type of an on-the-job education.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I totally learned on the go. But as we were talking about earlier, I was used to that at this point. I was pretty good at flowing where I needed to flow. And the beautiful thing about getting into the video game industry when I did was there wasn't the amount of specialization that there is now. I mean, now you come out of school, you're either an animator or you're a model builder or you're an environment artist or whatever. You're specialized. You've been trained along a certain track. Back then, we were all learning on the fly, and I got to do so many different kinds of things. And you might say that you fall into that trap of being a jack of all trades and master of none, and that's certainly true to a degree. But I mean, I got to do so many different types of things during the process of creating a video game. From the art standpoint, I pretty much did everything but the actual animation. I worked with animators who were doing and I directed some animators in certain situations, but I wasn't doing the actual animation with the 3D stuff because I didn't have those skills, but I learned how to work my way around it and how to work with animators. I worked with animators throughout my whole career in video games.
And how does that actually translate? I mean, did you provide storyboards and then they flesh them out from there, or am I just completely on the wrong track?
No, so storyboards was part of the process. Like I said, we got to do everything. For me, it would start with concepting, and that was developing visual ideas. I generally work mostly with characters, although I did some environment work. But you basically have to come up with the imagery, and then you have to develop it digitally, and that means not only in a 2D fashion, but then also in a 3D fashion when they create the character model, which I got to do later on in my career. Then you have to texture the model, and that's something I did a lot of too. And that's basically putting the skin on that 3D model.
Sure.
And then from there, it's rigging, probably already done, which is essentially creating the skeleton for those characters. But the concept, I got to do a lot of concepting, and that would be creating the look of the world and the look of the environments, and then working with the model builders to build those environments, and then to texture the environments to actually make them look real. So it's, like I said, it's amazing when I think about it, because you think about games, you can think about them as like little movies, because there's so many people working on these things, and you wonder how they ever get done with that many different people, that many different disciplines, but they do. And some of them are amazing.
And what would you say is your greatest achievement with working in the 2D modeling realm?
Well, in video games, that's a tough one. I think Marvel Ultimate Alliance was a big one for me, because it was sort of our swan song on the Marvel games until we got the Wolverine game later. But being able to overseeing the creation of over 200 characters for that game, and people told me we couldn't do it, and they were talking about outsourcing it all to Chinese studios. I said, no, we're going to do it all here. And people thought I was nuts for saying that. We did it with there were 3 of us that did it. I had 2.
Wait,
Derek
3
Smith,
people?
Yeah, Derek Smith and Gina Lohman and I did all of the characters for that game.
Oh my God!
We said it couldn't be done, and we did it. And
that's an incredible workload.
Oh my gosh! And I'll tell you, it was a great staff, and I was so proud of what they did on that game. It was pretty cool. Marvel was pretty impressed too, because they approved just about everything we threw at them, which says a lot for the kind of work they were doing. Aside from that, individually for me, one of my prouder moments in video games was in a ladder game called Singularity that we did. That was our own IP that we developed at Raven. And the Marvel team actually got shunted over to help finish that game. And it was about the 11th hour, and I remember my art director, Brian Pelletier, came to me and he said, you have to redesign the bad guy, the main bad guy for the game. I said, are you kidding? We're almost done. He says, no, you have to do it. And I was like, oh, my crap. So as a character named Demichev, he's this sort of, crazy, evil, brilliant, mad scientist dictator type of guy. And I essentially, within a matter of a couple of months, had to come up with a compelling concept for him, develop all the imagery, build the models, texture the models, and create a younger and an older version of him, because this is a time traveling game. And the only thing I didn't do with that character was animate him. And I had never gone through the process from start to finish like that prior to that character. And it turned out really well. And it's funny because the funny part of that story was I sort of blanked out a little bit when I was trying to come up with a compelling image for him. And I remember I went back to animation, and I didn't admit this until after the game came out, but the people said, well, who is he based on? He looks so cool. I said, you'll never believe me if I told you. And they said, no, tell us. And I would tell them, he's sort of loosely based on Fearless Leader from Rocky and Bullwinkle. And when I showed them the side-by-sides, they'd all go, oh my God, I can see it now.
Nice.
So that just goes back to a childhood favorite of mine.
And that's the thing I find amazing, is the fact that there is almost a seamless transition, because I mean, there's a classic way of telling stories, but now with the future generations, it's all about the 3D, the immersion of storytelling. And I'm gobsmacked at this point. It's just amazing to me that you were able to make that type of transition. Did you have any type of indecision when it came to that?
I think I was ready for a change. Like I said, the comic industry was moving in a direction that I didn't totally understand, and I didn't know if I really had a passion for it at that point, for where they were going and asking me to do. So I thought this is probably a good time to try something else. And like I said, it was a great time to get into video games because things were changing. I went through the transition from 8-bit two-dimensional graphics to 3D graphics to 32-bit to 64-bit to next generation to Xbox. I mean, there were some huge leaps in technological advancement there, and at each step of the process, you had to relearn everything, which was pretty hectic and pretty amazing at the same time. So, I mean, you just sort of, you gain skills by necessity. And when I was teaching video game art, I used to tell my students, you guys have a luxury that we didn't have, because you guys get to jump in and actually learn these skills in a level of depth that we, when we were pioneering this stuff, didn't get to do. We just learned what we needed to know, and we did it. But which is true. I mean, to this day, I probably don't have the depth of knowledge of some of my students, but I got to do a heck of a lot that they'll never get a chance to do. So, like I said, pretty amazing experience.
And that's a mind-blowing transition. I mean, because literally, you were sitting there in your college years drawing on a piece of paper. And I don't know how much that I can extend my respect with the fact that you have learned, you've adapted, and you've created things that people out in our audience, I know, are already envious of the fact that you've been able to do. And I believe that is, it follows back to the PEC acronym that I have, passion, effort, commitment. And it's amazing that as long as you're willing to learn, then there are greater things that are coming your way. If I can just backpedal a little bit on this, as far as it goes, what do you think in your whole artistic career was your greatest influence?
Oh, wow. That's tough.
I know I'm deep diving, but that's what we're about, because honestly, we're just taking the can opener and prying open your mind for other people to benefit.
Well, I think there's going to be, it's going to cut across some disciplines for me, because in comics, I mean, I was always so influenced by Kirby, but I didn't aspire to be Kirby or to draw like Kirby. But I wanted to know how somebody could be so inventive and so stylistically wacky at the same time. But I was definitely drawn towards Neil Adams and his groundbreaking approach when he broke into comics and kind of changed the way Batman looked and acted. But I think in comics, the guy that was sort of I can't even start to talk about my influence in comics, but I can finish without starting by bringing Jim Steranko into it, because Steranko was a hero because he was doing stuff that I wanted to do. He was
amazing.
His innovative approach to comic storytelling, while it didn't always succeed, it was always compelling as hell. You had to look at it. You had to take its measure, because it was just so, it was so new and it was so creative.
And if nobody has ever read the whole Nick Fury Scorpio storyline,
oh sure,
you were definitely missing out.
Yeah, but the art, the story, the graphics, and the design approach, and then the guy could paint on top of it. And I thought, no, this is the kind of Renaissance artist that I want to be, the kind of person that can do everything well. And so I really, really looked up to that. Now, in illustration, which was always something that I wanted to do, Frazetta killed me. I mean, I can remember seeing my first Conan Lancer paperback cover, which was the Frost Giants, and it was that one and the first one.
I'm there with you.
And my jaw dropped, and I started buying those things up, and it was only later that I actually read the stories and enjoyed them. But the artwork on the covers just absolutely blew me away.
What did you think about Boris?
Boris affected me a little bit differently, because even at a younger age, I was more drawn to a stylistic approach than I was towards a photographic approach. Gotcha. Boris is technically an amazing illustrator. I mean, the guy can paint like I can't even believe. A lot of his imagery I thought was gorgeous and beautiful. I remember he did a Tarzan painting with an elephant on it that just knocked me dead. But in some of his early stuff that he was doing for Savage Sword of Conan, I thought was kind of fun too, because he wasn't so slavishly devoted to the photographs as reference. But I remember some of his monsters looked a little weak to me, and they didn't have that imaginative power that somebody like Frazetta would put into a creature. Yeah, so like I said, I was much more drawn to Frazetta. The Doc, like I mentioned, the Doc Savage covers grabbed me. I thought that Bama was amazing, and at a very young age, I knew that Bama was also the guy that did those great Aurora monster model kit box cover art.
I was going to bring that up. Yes.
So I was hooked just because he was that guy, because that's my age. I mean, that stuff came back in when I was a little kid. We loved those models.
Dude, I put those models together myself.
Yep. So on the illustration side of things, but I cannot emphasize a single piece of art more than that Captain America Mitchell Hooks painting. It took me years to find out who did that painting, and I asked everybody. I asked Jim Steranko, I asked Stan Lee. Nobody knew who did that. And there's a funny little serendipitous story about that. Kevin Long who I worked with for years at Raven. He's a good friend of mine. He had done a lot of work for in role-playing games, and he had done a lot of great covers for Rifts, that game. And we were talking one day at lunch, and I was telling him the story about this wonderful Captain America box or paperback book cover, and I'd always wanted to know who the artist was, and I described the cover for him, and he said, I know that. I know who owns that original. And I said, you're kidding me. He's apparently his old boss at an old ad agency he used to work with actually owned the original and knew who did the artwork. And that's how I found out it was Mitchell Hooks. And I was just talk about floored. I couldn't believe that thing was actually out there still. So, but that cover, and you can probably look it up. The book cover is called The Great Gold Steel. And that thing, I remember when I saw that, it was the first time I had seen a painted version of a superhero that looked realistic. And I remember, like I mentioned before, I told my mom, I want to do this for a living. This is what I want to do someday. So those are some big influences on, during the course of my formative years.
Well, and I want to make sure not to capitalize your time because I know we've gone quite a bit. I do want to make sure that, to be honest with you, a lot of the interviews that I do are pretty much, and I won't lie, it's pretty much an inspiration to other people who are out there who are in these particular fields, who want to do what they want to do and be able to be successful with them. So I want to ask you this straight out. If there's any advice you can give to those young artists, to those young creators, as to what they need to be to become successful, what would you say?
Well, I can tell you what I tell my students. And this became very important when I was dealing with a lot of students that wanted to get into video games during a time when it was extremely difficult to crack that nut. What I always tell people is if there's something specific that you want, if there's a target you want to aim at, for instance, if you want to be a comic artist, if you want to be an illustrator, if you want to be a video game artist, find out what you want to do and find out who the best people are out there working now. And if you can't get a hold of them, research them. If you can get a hold of them without being annoying, email them some questions, ask some advice, get answers to things that you don't have answers for. But even more importantly, find out what makes them good. And then try to incorporate that into your work. Whatever it is that makes them good. I don't mean copy styles. I mean, find out, are they particularly strong with modeling? Are they particularly strong with anatomy? Are they very innovative in their approach to design? Are they concept artists? What are they doing and what sets them apart? And then try to figure out ways to rise to that level. Now, the caveat that goes with that is that chances are you're not going to rise to that level, at least not initially. But striving to counts for a lot. And as somebody that's hired artists in the past, we don't necessarily look for somebody who's established, especially in an entry-level position. We're looking for somebody that's got potential and drive and that's dependable, right? Mm-hmm. So those are the things that you want to strive for. But the worst thing you can do is just to keep on doing the thing that you like over and over again and think that somebody's going to be impressed with it, or copying somebody to the point of monotony where you never really get better than being a cheap imitation of that person that you're copying. That's not going to get you a career in art or in a creative endeavor. You really have to find a way to rise to that level. Let's get back to my mom. If you can do anything you want, but you got to be good. In order to be good, you got to find out what makes people good, and then you have to strive for that. Doesn't mean you'll necessarily get all the way there. That doesn't really matter. Striving can put you on a track. Without challenging yourself and without having that target to aim at, you tend to stagnate. And if you stagnate, art directors can see it a mile away. So to me, it's just a matter of identifying that thing that you want to do and find out who's out there doing it at the top of their game, at the top of the industry, and find out what makes them good and try to put yourself on a track to get there.
And honestly, that is an excellent summation. I would like to make sure, because I mean, gosh, we've gone 3 hours here. We have taken up some very valuable time. So I would like to thank everybody in the chat. And of course, if you're more interested in what Mr. Butler does, please feel free, go down to the description links. He is there at jeffbutler.com. Click and talk to him a little bit further. Of course, my criminally undersubbed people are there as well. But I would like to thank everybody who has come out tonight. And there's still a lot more of this story to be told. And I will say this, that Mr. Butler is welcome anytime he would like to come back on. There's still a lot more to talk about, but we're going to end it out for the night. I will say with my diagnosis that there is definitely nothing wrong with the patient, that his autism is definitely a spectacular thing that should be celebrated and cherished. And for everybody who decided to come out tonight and take a listen and to give a like, that I appreciate you coming out. And please do feel free to join us next week. I do have to mention just real quick that next week we are having on Gerald Casale. He is the co-founder of Devo. So it's going to be a different talk, but still with the same exact experience and learning. Because if it's about anything here, it is definitely about people being able to share ideas and be able to progress. And with that, I would like to thank you all for coming out tonight. And Doctor on Call, as far as it goes, we are closed for the evening. Thank you for stopping out.
Thanks.